I began writing this essay not as a critique, but as a comparison of each of Zelda's 3D titles. And yet the more I wrote about Breath of the Wild, the more I came to realize that the game was not so much a departure from Zelda's stagnation, as it has been said, but is in fact a complete misunderstanding of its legacy. And given this newfound perception, I reallocated my focus entirely on Breath of the Wild, using the other entries as points to illustrate just what that Zelda legacy looks like for me. I'm Mitchell Kopitch, and welcome to a comparative critique of The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The length of this video alone should be evidence enough that there will be full spoilers for Breath of the Wild, but as a major focus of this critique will be in comparisons with past entries, I'll have spoilers for those as well, particularly with the original, Ocarina of Time, and some of the other 3D titles. If you are new to the series, Breath of the Wild is a good starting place, honestly, but I would strongly encourage you to play the other entries, especially the original and Ocarina of Time. Not for my video, but for yourself, as they've left a tremendous mark on gaming history. But in terms of my video, the more Zelda games you've played, the better you'll understand where I'm coming from, and why I can't find it in me to appreciate Breath of the Wild with the same reverence as the other installments. I grew up with Zelda. I started on the original, Zelda 2, and Ocarina of Time. And since then I've been up to date with all the 3D titles at release day. In other words, the console Zelda experience is my forte, and what I'll be comparing Breath of the Wild with. The only one I haven't played is Skyward Sword, and we'll get to that in a bit. But for this video alone, I gave Breath of the Wild a second playthrough, and I also went back and played through the original, Zelda 2, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask, and even a little bit of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. So I'm coming at this video fresh off of recent playthroughs of a huge chunk of the Zelda library. I would say that as a long-term fan of the series, Breath of the Wild is a massive disappointment. But the truth is, I didn't go into this game thinking it would wow me at any point. I went into it because I was extremely stressed at the time, and the portability of the Switch seemed like a great way to help alleviate that. I just wanted to escape. At the end of my first playthrough, I thought I was simply too jaded. After all, I hadn't played a new Zelda in 10 years. But having played through Breath of the Wild twice now, and in revisiting the older entries, I'm convinced that, like Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild is an average game at best, and a failure to implement critical components of the Zelda formula at worst. And hopefully by the end of this critique, I can leave you with a renewed appreciation for what past Zelda games accomplished. Now don't get me wrong, on some level I respect the ideas this game plays with. When I heard the game would be an open world, I thought it was a great choice for Zelda. And as someone who doesn't like open worlds, this entry proved to be among the better open world experiences I've had. Zelda is no stranger to change. Indeed, it is one of, if not the greatest asset it has going for it. I say this because I suspect there will be no small shortage of people who will go into this video holding to the idea that I have a warped view of the situation, that the very notion of comparing this game with past entries means I fundamentally misunderstand the intent of Breath of the Wild. I find this perception to be neither productive nor true, and my reasons are twofold. Firstly, this game bears the Zelda logo, which means it has a quota of content that it will need to address in some way. If it does not meet some level of similarity in play or style, then we may as well be calling it something else entirely. Take for example the absolute basis of a Zelda game, its dungeons. Breath of the Wild doesn't have them, certainly not at the caliber of past titles, which to some means the game isn't concerned with dungeons and is therefore exempt for having the poor dungeon quality it maintains. I disagree. Mostly because poor quality is poor quality, no matter how you slice it. Nintendo claimed to have used the original game as inspiration for Breath of the Wild, but the results of this endeavor make it abundantly clear they didn't do their homework. If they had, they would have realized that dungeons make up the vast majority of playtime, setting not just a precedent for future games to follow, but a foundation to build upon. In other words, after 30 years of dungeon crawling, and frequent critical acclaim from it, quality dungeons is to be expected. So if you ignore a crucial element such as dungeons, instead opting to fulfill the promise of the original's vast open-world adventure, doing so means you have two targets you absolutely must hit. One, that you ensure you include other orthodox Zelda-themed content wherever possible to make up for the places in which you've omitted, and two, you succeed in the changes you have brought. And here's where I enter my second point. All of Breath of the Wild systems are in a rough draft state, half-baked, reaching their potential in very fleeting moments. After 170 hours put into this game, I'm afraid that's just not good enough. You can win me over with a Zelda game that doesn't have dungeons, but it better be a good game. Or you better come up with a way to make the game feel like Zelda, of which the game fails in both regards more often than not. Indeed, the phrase, "it doesn't feel like Zelda," is perhaps the only tangible critique anyone can give this game. And given that that sentiment is the ultimate subjective criticism a person could possibly have, it seems to undermine its credibility entirely. But not for me. There are reasons you feel that way. Reasons I feel that way. And I believe they are found within the support beams of the game's systems and its use of Zelda elements. The way I see it, Nintendo were the ones who decided to call this game Zelda, when what they should have done was make it a new IP, or else radically more different than past titles. Doing either would allow it to truly embrace the vision it embarks upon. But Breath of the Wild isn't interested in being its own game. Its unfinished systems can be found in every corner of its design, and it masks its problems under the Zelda banner, simultaneously capitalizing on nostalgia and spectacle, rather than nuance and structure. It's a game that doesn't have the nerve to be different while fundamentally misinterpreting the draw of Zelda. Instead, it follows the misguided wisdom of Skyward Sword, but more on that in a minute. I've broken the video into sections that revolve around a central theme, but there's quite a bit of bleed over among them. In general, I'll be starting off talking about Breath of the Wild as a commodity, discussing the decisions that were made in the pre-production phase, and how this has negatively impacted the game. Then I'll talk about Breath of the Wild proper. We'll break down how it plays, identifying what this game engages players with versus what past games did. And then finally, we'll close with some thoughts regarding Zelda's iconography, its motifs and traditions, and how Breath of the Wild misuses its heritage. So before we dive into it, I'll just say this. For what it's worth, I've played worse games. It's just that I've also played much better Zelda games. Ever since the Wii, Nintendo has got it into its head that games are about the physical world, when they've always been more interesting in a mental space. What do I mean? Well, when you're playing a game and you manage to forget about the controller, we call that immersion. It's the idea that you're so enraptured with what you're doing that you forget about everything else going on around you. And this can do a number of things. It can serve as a stress relief, it can make you excited about things, and it can spark your imagination. It's kind of like when movie theaters dim the lights, or how books usually don't bother telling you that they're a book, unless it's meant to be meta. There's this kind of unspoken norm in entertainment, that the creation should pretend it doesn't have an audience. That way we can both sort of imagine it being real for the short time we spend with it. Games can be more immersive, because you have agency over a character, and you get to be part of the story, if only in a small way. But you also have to learn the language of the game to do this. There's a physical hurdle. You have to keep track of what each button does. Once you do, though, it falls into your muscle memory, and then picking up the game to play it some more doesn't make you feel like you're behaving like a man-child. Instead, it feels the same way as picking up a book. You pick up a book to get back to that world, and nobody thinks you're insane for doing so. What does this all have to do with Nintendo, though? Their new consoles, the Wii and Wii U, coincide with a different philosophy, invariably making this whole immersion thing more difficult than it needs to be. Games end up being tailor-made for the console in question, much more concerned with the gimmick of the way you play the game, and much less about what's going on within the game itself. So in the case of something like Breath of the Wild, rather than explore new mechanics like dungeons or time travel, it's smarter to render dungeons to their most simplistic element, so as not to offend newcomers. And yet, previous consoles prove that quality games outweigh gimmicks in the long run. In the past, you have huge system sellers, cult classics, artistic masterpieces, or some combination. Even Super Smash Bros. For Wii U was played primarily with the GameCube and Pro controllers, essentially eliminating the gimmick of the console. When you compound this with the success of systems like the PS4 and franchises like Halo, I'm not sure what more evidence you need to affirm that making the controller vanish should be priority number one, not unlike the inked pages in a book. I'm sure some of this sounds all too familiar. Yes, the gimmicky consoles, we know. The thing is, though, the controller isn't really to blame, as we routinely do so. Instead, it's much more about the approach behind the company. Nintendo has been designing their games with gimmicks in mind since the launch of the Wii. They do this because they think it'll help them sell their hardware, which is a misinterpretation of what they're good at. For instance, the gimmick of the N64 was 4-player co-op, and the gimmick of the Wii was motion controls. Skyward Sword is the way it is because of those motion controls, but Majora's Mask is the way that it is because it's Majora's Mask. They didn't feel the need to shoehorn 4-player co-op into Majora's Mask just because the console could do that. Having 4 players fit games like Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing. It didn't fit Zelda. It didn't fit Paper Mario or Yoshi's Story either. They made those games the way they always have, with what's best for the game in question the top priority. With Skyward Sword, they didn't do that. They made Skyward Sword to help them sell Wiis and justify the existence of Wiimotes. My initial thought when this game came out was, well, Skyward Sword isn't my cup of tea, but I'll catch the next one. Because it's not some great sin that Nintendo opted for this direction. If anything, I admire them for it. It's a move that distances themselves from video game formulas, but sharing a closer bond with the realm of the physical space. Board games, tag, football, you get the idea. But at some point, it's important to recognize when hardware philosophy is overshadowing the artistic integrity of the brand. While Skyward Sword did have motion controls, it is far from its only problem. You take one look at Skyward Sword, the way it controls, its excessive hand-holding, its long-winded narrative, and its deviated focus from dark elements, and you tell me it's a Zelda game. The Skyward Sword was not made for the Zelda fan. Instead, it was made for Wii owners, kids, and non-gamers. So they figured, well, gee, we can't make the game too hard, we can't make it too complicated, we can't have dark creatures in it. What will the parents think? How are newcomers to the series going to feel? We can't alienate them. But rather than make a new game to attract that audience and leave Zelda well enough alone, they had to put Link, Zelda, and Ganon in the game to manipulate the fanbase into picking it up, when it would have been more sensible to create a new IP. Sparse similarities in aesthetics should not be the standard for what constitutes an entry in a series. But this is where perhaps Nintendo and myself disagree. They see Zelda, in a similar vein as other brands, but mostly with Zelda, as a tool to articulate the design philosophy of their newest hardware. That's all Skyward Sword, though, you say. Well, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but while the Nintendo Switch is more adaptable for traditional play, it has its own gimmick, and Nintendo is going to make for damn sure they capitalize on it with their first-party titles. To me, the Switch seemed like a chance to get back into the Nintendo brand. You can play the best games Nintendo makes, however and whenever you want to play them. No gimmicks, no lack of third-party support, all seemed perfect. But after playing Breath of the Wild, I remain skeptical of the console's future, as it now seems like dumbing down first-party exclusives is the route Nintendo wants to take for the long term. They're not content to have faith in the quality that Zelda games used to have. Instead, they feel the need to rethink countless decisions that were brought up and handled better in previous titles. For me, Zelda is a fantasy dungeon crawler with a wide range of moods, from action to puzzle solving to drama, a light RPG with a steady form of progression, rising difficulty, and finally a game about meaningful secrets. All of these things are prominent in nearly every Zelda title, including the original. What the original lacked in terms of a good story, it made up for it with aesthetics. The fairy boy in the green hat with a sword and shield, Ganon the pig monster, the princess, the Triforce, series staples, bosses, Goma, Dodongo, Darknuts, Gibdoos. Encountering Darknuts for the first time in level 3 is that moment when you realize, oh snap, now it's getting serious. You can sense that push forward. And while the 3D titles don't have the same gameplay challenges that the original held, they had the aesthetics, and sometimes they were even intertwined with the narrative itself. Breath of the Wild, as an evolution, perfectly accommodates for a modern audience, succeeding where Skyward Sword failed, which is what Zelda games have taken the mantle of doing, and is, at least culturally, what makes the series so revolutionary. Nintendo bravely addresses the new batch of consumers' needs while routinely accommodating for returning fans, going so far as to have Zelda represent the spirit of play they have in mind for each console. And they do this better with Zelda than any other brand except perhaps Mario. The original Zelda had a save feature. Ocarina broke ground in terms of three-dimensional combat with Z-targeting. Skyward Sword was meant to immerse players into kinetic satisfaction, and Breath of the Wild's tranquil setting and brevity and challenge highlight both the Wii U and Switch's adaptability to follow the player in whatever comfortable position they are in. This point alone is why Zelda as a brand and an innovative business strategy is the real achievement of Breath of the Wild. It's just that, like Skyward Sword, it accomplished this by forgoing the nuances of Zelda's narrative at the same time. Zelda's fiction, Zelda's timelessness. It's been bled and gutted when it didn't need to be. It's just smart business. But Zelda has always been smart business. It just used to have artistic integrity alongside it. Judging by the game's reception, it's clear I'm among a small minority. But it needs to be said, not all of us are on board with these changes. Breath of the Wild was designed for a hybrid system, so to them, that meant they anticipated people playing the game in short spurts. You pick up Breath of the Wild for 10 to 15 minutes while you're on the bus or on a break at work, then you put it away. Knowing that they'll only have your attention for that brief moment made them think it would be better to tailor the Zelda experience to a harebrained lifestyle. That's why the dungeons are chopped into tiny chunks you can complete in less than 5 minutes. That's why the weapons break so quickly. That's why the storyline is so bare bones. Every time you pick up Breath of the Wild, it has to surprise you with something new. You have to reach some kind of resolution with that new thing, and then the rest of the game needs to not deviate too far from this recipe. There are tutorials in nearly every shrine. Not because this shrine could potentially be your first one, but because Nintendo has accounted for the fact that it might have been hours, if not days, before you were able to pick it back up and play again. When you come back, you want to continue your progress, but you don't remember a whole lot, so the game teaches you every single time. That's why each weapon attacks within the same small handful of categories, instead of having more unique movesets. Over time, you'll grow a familiarity with the game, but you don't want to have the player confused over how a weapon functions if they haven't played in a while. That's why we don't have unique enemy types, why locations are only varied in a small half-dozen palettes. Don't overwhelm the player. What if they forget? This is also why there are no real secrets to be found, and everything is handed to the player with the absolute minimum amount of effort. You see, Breath of the Wild gives off the impression of a game that doesn't have any confidence, repeatedly throwing stupid shit in my face to try to impress me. What Nintendo has failed to account for is their core audience. People who play Zelda because they played the previous titles. People who take days off of work to play through the game over the course of very lengthy sessions. Breath of the Wild is a game about wanting. It's carefully designed to entice you into playing it, if only for a few minutes. And it wouldn't be a big deal. All this catering to the masses. But what this simultaneously did is make the game impossible to invest in. And it irks someone like myself, because with just a tiny bit more thought and consideration, they could have had the best of both worlds. In my opinion, Breath of the Wild needed to be far more conscientious of Zelda's history, or else be even more different than it is. What it goes for instead is a disingenuous middle ground that I can't get behind. I feel more than I ever have about the series that Breath of the Wild is a product first. You can call me a romantic or idealistic or whatever you like, but I've always thought Zelda maintained a good degree of artistry over the years. So what went horribly wrong? Well, let's dive into it, starting with the big changes, the artistic direction they took in the pre-production stage. The first way you could notice this shift in direction is with the Sheikah Slate, which is quite obviously a reskinned Nintendo Switch. The Slate could also be compared with the Wii U gamepad, an iPad, a smartphone. Now, I'll admit, the Slate does some good things for Zelda. Not only does it condense a huge amount of inventory management, which they'll ruin with the game's combat system, but we'll get to that later, but it also allows for true non-linear progression, something the series has been unable to achieve ever since its very inception. So that's real fine, but why does it have to be in the shape of a video game console? Why not a bottomless sack? Poke fun at the fact that we're always making fun of how much equipment Link is able to carry. The route they took is too tongue-in-cheek for me. The Sheikah Slate reeks of advertisement, which makes it feel more like a business strategy. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to think about business strategies when I'm playing a game. I want to think about fantasy when I'm playing Zelda. It being an advanced piece of technology took me out of the experience. Why is there so much tech in Hyrule? I get radar pulses, scanning the environment. Your audio output is tracked and calculated on your smart device, collecting gears from drones that lock onto you, as if they have heat or motion sensing technology. I suppose those things have always been around, but they've never been an integral part of Link's equipment or the lore all that much. As far as I can tell, Zelda is a hybrid of Japanese and Celtic mythology, and don't tell me there isn't enough compelling lore to extract from there. There are even other myths that show up from time to time also, such as the centaurs and the Chinese dragons, and these fit fine. They've been around since the original. They fit in a high fantasy setting. The tech compromises my immersion. And unfortunately, the immersion breaking doesn't stop there either. One of the biggest features of a Zelda game is its dungeons. For now, all that needs to be said is there's hardly anything to distinguish the Divine Beasts from the shrines. Both the beasts and the shrines have a very similar art direction, which they justified with the lore, but it doesn't excuse the fact that everything looks the same. Twilight Princess is a good example of how you have similarly structured dungeons, but compensated for this by offering a unique aesthetic style for each one, while simultaneously raising the difficulty as you progress. In terms of style, every Divine Beast and Shrine are all the same. What's more is they look like they were built by robots, rather than a race of people who would have taken liberties with the structure to satisfy an artistic concern. Previous Zelda dungeons frequently had unique architecture that in many cases was exclusive to a single room of a single dungeon, and rarely, if ever, seen again afterwards. What's more is nearly every dungeon would have these details. That aesthetic nuance wasn't always relegated to the background either, such as in Ocarina of Time, which had the scythe blades, and the ship in the Shadow Temple, or the statue in the Spirit Temple. When Zelda first debuted in the 3D space, Ocarina was the first one, and it set the groundwork for many traditions that the series largely hasn't challenged until recent years. One of those details was the artistry in the architecture of the dungeons, which helped reinforce the idea that these were places that had been built by a culture with their own unique visual style and interests, not unlike the Sphinx made by the Egyptians in real life. You could argue this was done to make the limited graphical capabilities stand out more, but ask yourself, how much better would it have been if Breath of the Wild accounted for this? Everything that counts as a form of dungeon in Breath of the Wild looks like it was built by aliens or robots at best, and children messing around with Legos at worst. While the Divine Beasts do a decent enough job to make the traversal of the giant an integral part of the experience, they do next to nothing to prevent the player from recognizing that they're looking at a puzzle. Is this really a war machine? Where's the cockpit? How about the mess hall? The engineering deck? The Poe sisters in Ocarina show how varied puzzles engage the player while simultaneously feeling as though they belong in a haunted forest castle, concealing themselves within paintings until the player figures out that shooting an arrow into them while they're depicted in frame forces them into a space in which they can be fought directly. It's a nice, haunting sequence. The shrines, by contrast, are all about cement blocks, the arbitrary placement of torches and magnetic currents randomly placed along the ground. While previous games did utilize boring blocks also, I think it's fair to say they did a great deal more to convince the player that they were in a real place, thanks to the instances when they do incorporate the puzzles into the setting, and in no small part also to the music and varied art direction. The shrine theme is quite good, and I'll have more to say on that later, but the art direction is severely lacking in authenticity. Not only is there no variety between them, but what aesthetics they do have look like space alien hieroglyphics. It also uses orange and blue, which are complementary, sure, but more importantly, they're very sci-fi colors. I mean, look at Michael Bay's Transformers, or the Reclaimer saga in Halo. The only thing missing is excessive lens flares. Not that those are inherently bad, but again, that's sci-fi. I get they wanted the shrines to be in stark contrast with the overworld, which is helpful for identifying them, but every time I enter a shrine, I feel like I'm playing Zelda the video game, because it isn't like you could feasibly envision how a puzzle would make sense in the space that you're in. To reaffirm, the spinning scythe was a puzzle because you had to collect the silver rupees. It was an obstacle, but it also looked like something you'd find in a torture chamber, in some place that would worship the dead. And this in turn made up for what was otherwise a simple puzzle. Because 3D Zeldas have only rarely been about truly challenging puzzles. They were instead far more interested in having you navigate a space. It engages the mind with a mixture of medium puzzle solving against narrative-relevant aesthetic backdrops. Once you know a puzzle, it's best if there is something else to interest a player for another playthrough. Take the Deku Tree, how the whole layout for the level was an extreme verticality. You climb up it, drop down it, just like you naturally would if you were inside a tree of that size. There's a tangible emotion to the interior of a tree. It's rooted in the theatrics of the game's narrative. We don't dislike the Deku Tree stage because it's about as simple and plain as to solve as many of Breath of the Wild shrines. We instead love it because it convinces us that we are interacting with something real, something we know from our world, and thus gives us the chance to feel like we're participating in something greater. Not to mention the motion of going up, our hero climbing into a newfound inner resolve, then the drop, the descent, the deep plunge into the depths of Grendel's lair. What used to feel like playing around in a sacred, ancient, and oftentimes horrific places now feels like playing around in a tech demo for a video game. There are no spiderwebs, pantheon statues, or coffins. What's more is their names don't even try to convince you that this is a real sanctuary made by ancient monks. Okay, so where's the shrine called Better Watch Out? Or how about jumping over a ledge, picking up a box and setting it on a button? Then you got the gyro shrines. Look, I'm playing golf. Why the hell am I playing golf with gyro controls in a world with fairies and magic? Look at the shrine. Look at this. Do you want to know how long this took me? I literally stood up and held the controller as if I was bringing a royal their tiara, and it still took forever. I was on a break at work when I pulled out my Switch and I got set up in tabletop mode. I did not have my Joy-Con grip with me, so I opted to play with the two Joy-Cons separately. And fortunately enough, I came across another gyro shrine. And as I was playing, it dawned on me that only the right Joy-Con was gyro sensitive. Earlier that same day, the puzzle was utterly impossible in portable mode because, unbeknownst to me, the center of the tablet was not the center of gravity on screen. The center of gravity was in my right hand, and I had no clue this was the case. I was especially perturbed because I specifically set gyro controls off once I noticed they made aiming with the bow more annoying than it needed to be. Even turning this feature off never removed them entirely for some unexplainable reason. So, call me an idiot, but I read the box for both the Switch and the game case for Breath of the Wild, had seen all the trailers for both products, and deliberately went into the menu and turned gyro controls off. So excuse me for not realizing that I could have saved myself both the hassle and the embarrassment from people in the office who were looking at me like I was a child on an Etch-a-Sketch. Where in the hell is it specified that the right Joy-Con would be the center of gravity? I don't know why it has to be in the game, because it doesn't add to the challenge, other than fighting against the controller itself. But if it does have to be there, at the very least it should have been brought to my attention in a trailer, a box description, in-game text, somewhere. The big downside to the all-in-one combo Sheikah slate for all your puzzle-solving needs is that it makes the entirety of the shrines available, and thus they have no progression, no rising difficulty. You might see this as a good thing, but personally I really enjoyed how later dungeons would present greater challenges. I mean, there's no comparison between Woodfall Temple and Stone Tower in Majora's Mask. I often think the earlier Zelda dungeons are too easy, but having that gradual rise in difficulty is nice, and it helped mask the simplicity of them. Think back to Ocarina, for instance. Part of the reason the Forest Temple is so significant, memorable, and loved is due to the fact that the previous 3 dungeons were only either tutorials or half dungeons. They don't have a boss key, they don't have keys in general. They're smaller, it's a simplified version of what adult Link has to face. And isn't that true to life? How as adults things are more complicated. The stakes are higher. Some people argue that you can't make any shrine too difficult because it might theoretically be the player's first shrine since leaving the Great Plateau. But this argument doesn't make any sense, since each shrine is warpable. So, if it is too difficult, the player can conclude for themselves that it is and come back to it later. Furthermore, this dilemma was already solved in 1986. Every dungeon had a number blatantly in view, giving you a clear estimate of its difficulty. Breath of the Wild could have done similarly. And what's more, they could have added to this by making the rewards of harder dungeons more valuable. Finally, if you were willing to name some dungeons a moderate test of strength, I think it's okay to have some called a moderate test of thought. Speaking of the strength test, this was literally what I did when I got to one that was too difficult. Left and came back to when I was more experienced and had better equipment. It's no secret that these arenas are all pretty much the same, just different weapons. It's not like they're Dark Nuts or Iron Knuckles, you know, something that would make sense in a dungeon. These are just robots. Again, in a fantasy. We couldn't even get robot Dark Nuts. But what am I saying? Robots are not fun to fight. There's only one game that I can think of that did robot fights decent, and that's Mass Effect, because the Geth were sentient, and because when you shot them, there would be this gush of liquid spewing out of them. So they basically felt like a sentient being. And that's the big problem with robots, they're mechanical and boring. I mean, why are multiplayer games so popular? It's because you're playing against real people, and you know they're sentient. Games like Dark Souls do a good job of making AI enemies feel intelligent, with a wide variety of moves, unapologetic aggression, and comparable stats. It's not perfect, but it gets the job done. You feel immersed. At this point, if you're still not convinced that Breath of the Wild is basically just a huge marketing strategy to sell Switches, then let me remind you of the Nintendo Switch t-shirt you can have Link wear in the game. I don't have footage of this because I didn't buy the DLC, but I do remember playing the game on my brother's Wii U, who did have it, and I remember opening a treasure chest and finding a red t-shirt with a Switch logo on it and being like, what? This is something you put on your Mii, not on the character in the game proper. I get I don't have to wear that shirt, but it's the attitude behind it. This would have never flown in Ocarina of Time, never. Everyone on the committee would have been like, we're trying to create a deeply engrossing world for the player to get lost in. And you want a Tunic that has an N64 logo on it? If you keep that shirt, hell, don't even wear it. Every time you bring up the menu, you'll see it. It's not even an interesting shirt in its own right. You can't even dye it different colors from what I hear. If I want to buy the DLC, then I want to open every chest and have every item I acquire actually try to contribute to some rational narrative consistency, or at least a cosplay of classic Zelda characters, as the other costumes managed to do. It'd be like if you were reading a book and on every other page there was a half a dozen spaces with some text in the middle that said, by the way, you're reading a book. How do you like it? Gonna buy the sequel? Eh? It's the same debate with loot boxes in games. If it's in the game, it affects my gameplay. I see it, and I either interact with it, or I have to go out of my way to avoid it. And that's not what any good developer should want. What is this? Gen Z humor? Purely referential? I'm playing an NES and there's a character wearing a shirt that says NES on it, get it? What's more is you don't get a Wii U shirt, oh no, just for the Switch. It's shameless self-promotion. Link taking selfies is another wholly unnecessary, distracting inclusion, since you can just take photos with the Switch console itself, but I digress. Bottom line, there's too much tech and too much hip going on with this game for my taste. Like the two inventors who felt like they came out of Splatoon. Look at some of the things they're saying. The electric guitar? Really? And no, I haven't forgotten that Majora's Mask had a band as well with a guitar. And no, I didn't care for Majora's Mask either. But at least it came with a dramatic storyline. I just do not understand why Zelda has to try to be hip. Zelda is one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, and one of gaming's biggest franchises ever. It always sells well, it always gets above average, if not stellar reviews. Nintendo can basically do whatever it wants with it as long as they put in a shred of effort. I don't see any reason for why Zelda would need to include forgettable, hip characters. It's not like 5 years from now someone's going to be like, oh, I miss Robbie. I miss his air guitaring. Other character interactions, like the crazy flower lady, fared a lot better. Teenage Mutant Ninja Goron did not. And the rest I have trouble remembering at all. For every great character moment, like the endearing hypermasculine bro Gorons, comes a lengthy story quest of the badgering Zora prince, or an utterly ambivalent Rito chief who might as well have been a plaque, or a napkin with some scribbles on it telling you where to go for all he contributed. Again, I contrast. Durnia has to be played a song to cheer his mood up, but it's not enough to convince him to give you the Goron's Ruby. That requires clearing out the Dodongos in the cavern. This Riddle Bird is convinced by having you shoot a couple of targets with a bow. A show of character would have gone a long way to make the narrative more memorable. By contrast, the schoolroom in the Gerudo Palace was a nice touch about that culture's interest and ideas surrounding love and romance, which makes sense because they're a tribe of all women and have to seek out men from other communities to further their population. These moments are good world building, while simultaneously addressing some confusion that's been permeating these games for a while now. The story content with the Gerudo leader is unremarkable, but serviceable. The real good stuff is in the conversations and observations the player makes for themselves. And sadly, the Gerudo are about the only culture that's been deepened. Deepening cultures is not a huge concern of mine for Zelda, but I greatly appreciate the thought that went into this, and would like to experience more of it in the future. What I don't care to experience in a Zelda game is a motorcycle. I suppose I could chalk all of this up to sci-fi and advanced technology being exclusive features of this specific game, in the same way that the pirate aesthetic was exclusive to the Wind Waker. And so with that perspective, I can put aside my preferences and enjoy the experience as best as I can, which is what I did. But I would still have contested the idea in the pre-production stage. Sci-fi, I suspect, is only an inclusion out of a combination of a desperate attempt for a new theatric, and because it offers many conveniences that other themes would not. Its biggest offense is, of course, in things like the motorcycle, which is far too removed from a fantasy aesthetic and contrasts severely with the surrounding atmosphere. The breath of the wild, as it were. Yeah, I'm just soaking up that nature now. What's more, is the team already had a good theme to work with, that being a post-apocalypse. This could have been taken further to make the game far more of a survivalist experience, with limited resources, rough-edged characters who were truly going mad or depressed from the state of the world. The reason a pirate theme doesn't bother me in Wind Waker is that not only is it more synonymous with fantasy, but it was given a vital role in the story and gameplay, that being an ocean full of islands. You get a boat, treasure maps, the works. Where and which did Breath of the Wild capitalize on the apocalypse setting? No one seems to be the slightest bit bothered more than a touch of bad weather from Ganon's forces. And since we never speak with Ganon, he doesn't seem to be too interested in anything other than Zelda and Hyrule Castle. The Yiga clan, a fanatical group of Ganon supporters, are the single organization that has an objective in the world, and actively attempt to fulfill it. The reason Star Wars is fantasy, and Star Trek is science fiction, is that science fiction is about the future of technology, humanity, or both, whereas fantasy is about good versus evil, chosen ones, end swords, and sorcery. In other words, science fiction is far more than just an aesthetic, and while it can be fun to use it as an aesthetic from time to time, it's far too often implemented as a crutch to bring modern conveniences into a setting that wouldn't ordinarily have them, and certainly wouldn't be exclusive to a single character, as the Sheikah Slate is made out to be. It's not my biggest gripe with the game that Ganon has seemingly no knowledge or interest in hunting down the Sheikah Slate, but the game just had to go the extra mile of affirming that Link is the only one who can use it, and what is an extremely vain attempt to remind us that this is supposed to be a fantasy. At that point, the Chosen One element isn't really needed because we're the only ones with the slate as it is. Thus, the monks shouldn't call us a Chosen One because we use the slate like we were supposed to as a mindless pawn, but instead should have called us a Chosen One in the event that we complete all the trials, thus proving we are worthy of the classic Tunic garb, and making it at least narratively relevant why it couldn't be given to us from the start. In a twist to the Zelda formula, we wouldn't be a Chosen One just because. We would be one because we were lucky or unlucky enough to have been given the slate and with it all of its responsibilities. Keep in mind that Link failed 100 years ago. Who's to say the monks or other characters wouldn't be skeptical that Link is the Chosen One they once believed him to be? The tension would have been further raised if Ganon eventually discovered our awakening, perhaps after we complete a divine beast or two, and could then issue an order or a legion of elite monsters to hunt down the slate. What we have instead is the Yiga clan, who are completely nonsensical and disjointed from the main narrative. Admittedly, the encounter with their boss was mildly humorous, and while they're there to put some substance to the world, the choice of them over something that would have fit either the post-apocalypse or sci-fi themes better would have been a show of narrative consistency. Because beyond that one cheery fight, the ninja theme is just another element in the mixing pot that doesn't contribute to the narrative in any meaningful way, preferring to be content for the sake of content. On top of the futuristic elements, and the absence of his green hat and tunic, which as I just explained don't have a good reason for being kept from the player, Link is not left-handed. Probably to appease a wider audience who not only knows nothing about the character, but now don't even know the three main traits he's known for, the others being his green hat and his relationship with the Triforce of Courage. When you start out Breath of the Wild, it doesn't become a Zelda game until you buy a figurine, scan it multiple times over the course of several days, ignore a certain chest and motorcycle from the expansion, and then you have to go into the menu and switch this to Pro. Then you have to bring up the map and turn off the radar pulse. And finally, the game can start to feel more like a Zelda title. If you're not interested in watching this entire review, then don't worry, because I can basically sum up every single problem with this one example. Instead of having proper dungeons that Zelda has been doing for more than 30 years, they opted to go with what are called divine beasts and shrines. This example is going to talk about a shrine called Power of Electricity. It first introduces the player to electricity balls that you should put in a place to make a thing happen. That's fine, it's just an example, and not the shrine itself. You go a little bit forward and you see a locked door. To your left are two platforms, one in which already has a power orb on it, and the other doesn't. Now, obviously we don't need one power orb to be there since you were just taught that putting electric balls on circular spaces is what you're supposed to do. Do you really need another example? Either there should be no balls here and have the player collect two to bring here, or else you should have started with this room, and never mind that time waster of an opening. But moving on. You go right and find... hold on a second. Let me just decide what weapon I don't mind wasting. Yeah, I guess so. Alright, so you defeat a bad guy, and then there's your orb. It's hanging by a rope, which you can shoot down. I'm pretty sure there are other ways to get it, but in any case, it's fine by me. You have to use your head to figure out how to get it down, so that's all good. You make a little stroll back over to the puzzle, which isn't really a puzzle since you knew what you had to do simply by looking at it. The puzzle causes this block to fall over, allowing you access across the gap into the chest. So basically, you just made a bridge, which is kinda neat. You go up 3 flights of stairs to get a key. Then you run back across the conveyor belt and open a locked door. Okay, stop right there. You grabbed a sphere and brought it to a location, but instead of having it open the door immediately like it did at the start of the shrine, it made you walk up some stairs, open a chest, which includes a mini cutscene, and then walk all the way back. In past Zelda games, a key was usually something you would stockpile for later use in the dungeon. You were rewarded for thoroughly searching for it, and could oftentimes decide what room you wanted to access next. Other times you'd have to find the key in a room before you can progress. But doing so in either case meant you were expected to thoroughly examine a room until you've exhausted all possibilities. In other words, it felt like exploring a dungeon. Anyways, let's move on. So you fight another baddie. Hold on. I like the look of it, but yeah, I guess so. Alright, so you enter the next room, and you see 2 pools of water, and electrical energy that needs to connect to a point. Like before, one of these is solved for you, except in this case it's better because it initially seems like you'll need to use the limited number of metal cubes it gives you to make it work. The problem is, I don't actually know how to solve this yet, but I don't need to. Because if you recall, we can walk back to the previous room, take one of those electric orbs that you no longer need kept in that location, and use that to cheat our way through what was probably intended to be the only challenging part of the mini-dungeon. As some people like to say this is open game design, it allows the player to do things in their own way. I guess that makes sense since I'm technically solving something, but it feels really inauthentic and underwhelming when 1, I don't have any comprehension of how the puzzle could have been solved with the 3 cubes it gave me, and 2, it took less than 5 seconds to figure this out. Maybe if the developers had the forethought to make those orbs hold the door open instead of making us get a needless key, we wouldn't be able to cheat our way through. Now this wouldn't be so bad, except for the fact that 98% of all shrines are like this. The choice to not do this must have been deliberate. And I went back to see if I could solve this without the need of an extra cube. And you can. You literally just move the objects closer together. That's it. That's all you do. Another thing that doesn't work too well is that the reward you get is a Hylian orb, which is the same thing you got last time. Now that's not a huge deal, but it kind of diminishes the mystery of what the reward is going to be. Not only this, but the discovery of the shrines isn't a big secret either. Most of them are in plain sight on the overworld, and you just walk up to it. Now let's compare this with secrets in Ocarina of Time. Not with its dungeons, just general secrets. The first thing to note is the entrance. This one can be found by using a bomb in the middle of nowhere. You got this one here that's hidden in someone's grave. And for this one, you have to play a certain song for it to open. Now look at how you find nearly every shrine in Breath of the Wild. You spot it from a distance, out in the open, with nothing to conceal it. You walk up to it, and there you go. Some of them can be solved with riddles, but after doing so, you usually just get the reward in question, not an actual shrine challenge to complete, which makes you wonder why it has to be in a shrine at all. Now let's look at what's within each secret. The first one is a business scrub who will sell you a piece of heart for 10 rupees. That might seem like a formality, but it's a little bit different than opening a chest like usual. Then this one has a brand new shield, and if you bomb this wall, you'll find a fairy fountain behind it. Lastly, this one has a Sheka stone, a couple of spiders, and a gold scutula, which is the reward. Now let's look at the rewards for 3 different shrines. It's true that there are secondary treasures in each shrine, but only in rare cases are they new sets of armor, which is the only thing of value since all the weapons you find can be replaced. The last thing we need to go over with the shrines is how long it takes. First, there's the walking towards it from the moment that you see it. I guess most people wouldn't include this, so I won't either, but as a personal aside, the walk to the shrine isn't very engaging since it's not a surprise. Identifying shrines as shrine quests also gives away what little surprise we might have had. Bombing the floor to reveal a cave or playing a certain song in a certain place are surprises, which makes them better. Anyways, let's just start the activation. So you activate the shrine, which causes it to become a warp point on your map. Well, that's fine, but why does it need to enter a cutscene to show the door opening? And why does the door need to be closed at all? How about the elevator won't move unless you have the Sheka slate on your person, so that only Link is allowed access? Or how about we have the door, and it does gradually open, but the player is allowed to move while this goes on, so they're not button mashing through a cutscene they don't care to see twice, let alone 120 times. Next you have to take the elevator down, which involves a loading screen, a lengthy one. Then you have to skip another cutscene. Then you do the shrine for 2.5 minutes, and that's not an exaggeration. Then you have 2 more cutscenes to skip, which are all identical, and you have to click through the fanfare of the granting of an orb too, when a chest would have worked just fine. I get it's supposed to be a dramatic moment, but no one is going to feel anything after about a dozen or so of these. And then you get one more loading screen, a lengthy one, and then finally you can get back into the game. Sometimes I don't feel like doing a shrine the moment I see it, and so I'll just mark it and come back to it later. But God forbid you want to do shrines back to back. With them being so short, it's not worth doing. You'll just be sitting at a loading screen forever. Now, it's not like they're all bad. I kinda liked Wind Guide. That one was better, mostly because it had multiple rooms and puzzles that required kinetics. In fact, this game performs much better when it gets you doing things. It's when it asks you to stop and think that it utterly fails. Like, there's this part when you have to get a bomb over to these blocks. I was gonna sit there for a moment and figure it out. Then I realized this game is kinda long, and if I just use a bomb arrow I can get through it faster. On my first playthrough, I didn't know what to use this powder cake for either. I didn't even make the connection that I was supposed to send it over to the blocks. I just kinda dropped it, wondering if that might make a thing happen. It didn't. Now, I understand there's a technical reason for why the loading screens need to be there, but that doesn't change the fact that they're too long weighted against how short the shrines are, and they're too boring in and of themselves. You might be thinking this isn't a fair thing to critique, but when you have previous titles that handled this better, and even games of today that have more nuanced ways of masking loading screens, I think it's fair to say that what we have here is really not up to par. So, this is obviously intentional, right? And I'm having a bit of fun on the creator's part, but in all seriousness, I legitimately do not see how anyone who's played a Zelda game would consider this method of approach in keeping with the series' spirit. The aesthetic sameness of the shrines, the simplicity of the puzzles, and the tedious cutscenes and loading screens all make them vastly inferior to previous Zelda dungeons. You might be thinking that's okay since I'm not supposed to see them as a dungeon, but in that case I compared them with how caves have been handled in the past, and in that comparison the shrines lack creative methods to gain entry, have predictable rewards, and are not a natural part of the world. Pulling out a grave and finding a cave with a zombie in it doesn't require you to make too huge a leap in logic to get there. The elements are interlinked with the fantasy aesthetic. The shrines aren't able to achieve this level of immersion. The divine beasts aren't any better either. They're too short, aesthetically identical, and with the exception of Vandaboris, were much too easy. And they don't have unique treasures to acquire or unique bosses to fight either. What I'm saying is, the shrines and the divine beasts are vastly lesser versions of past Zelda content at best, and at worst a malnourished catastrophe. And this is where you'll say, well, the overworld. Obviously Breath of the Wild is more interested with the landscape of Hyrule, and what it can accomplish in that space, rather than the dungeons and secrets that have been higher priorities in the games of old. Alright, I'll bite, let's talk about the overworld. Its systems and ideas, everything from its combat to resources. Now it's not going to be relevant to compare past overworlds with Breath of the Wild for a number of reasons. Mostly because Hyrule Field has largely served the role of providing a hub that connects the dungeons. To that end, the past games have largely done a good job of this, with varying strategies. Ocarina's hub was a bit too large for how little substance was in it, but it did give the world of Hyrule some depth, giving the player a chance to physically traverse the space they're on a quest to liberate. It was impressive for the time, the day-to-night cycle added a touch of realism. It works, by no means a problem. It's limited by hardware where Breath of the Wild is not. Majora's Mask does similarly, but this time tightening up the links between areas. It's easier to navigate and doesn't waste any time. But it does have the disadvantage in having extreme differences between environments. 1 second you're on the side of a snowy mountain, only to be on a sunny beach the next. Breath of the Wild has this problem also, which is strange as Ocarina showcases a far more natural transition from one biome to the next. It worked for Majora's Mask because that whole thing was weird. In Breath of the Wild, it's supposed to be organic. Wind Waker went for a pirate aesthetic, relying quite heavily on a near one-to-one with how it feels to be sailing around from one island to the next. It works, though it's sometimes a tough pill to swallow. Sometimes you just want to get to a place so the game can continue. Twilight Princess decided to be a return to Ocarina's hub system, and does so very poorly by making the space larger and with what feels like even less substance in it. But like the original, it's meant to be little else than provide narrative continuity between the dungeons. And at least in that, Twilight Princess delivers on the dungeon front. And Skyward Sword just sucks. What I'm saying is, the overworld has been a secondary concern. It's a means to an end. With Breath of the Wild, the overworld is in fact that end. The overworld is an often underwhelming point in the series. It was the overlooked middle child, and so I do consider it more than okay to dedicate a Zelda game to the reinforcement of the overworld experience. For what it's worth, the overworld isn't half bad at all. but it isn't without significant shortcomings. Where Breath of the Wild excels over predecessors, I will be sure to highlight, and where it falters, I will compare with past titles only in the event that the past has a solution to a similar problem. With that, let's talk about the overworld. The UI in past Zelda has been too big, too dramatic, and too in-your-face. Breath of the Wild fixes many of these problems with the Pro Mode, which should be a feature in all future games, not just Zelda, but games as a whole. It's minimal effort that makes veteran players more comfortable, and I'm very happy to have this option. With Pro Mode activated, this leaves only the hearts and stamina in view, so I'm just going to talk about those. The hearts are regulated to an appropriately small but visible size. A vast improvement over its predecessors. It's also the first to expand its health cap from 20 to 30 hearts, which is perhaps the best addition Breath of the Wild brings to the Zelda formula, because it literally has no drawbacks. We begin with 3 hearts, as is tradition, the additional 10 hearts are worthwhile, and the sound and visual cues are all fantastic. And I hope we can expect this style and careful attention to detail and approachability in future titles. This is, without question, the best heart system of any Zelda game. All of its subtle changes contribute to having a nostalgic, functional, and easy-on-the-eyes system. I wish I could stop there, though. 30 Hearts gives developers the option to make enemies with a greater range of difficulty, and it also allows more adjustments to the healing than ever before. But Breath of the Wild doesn't capitalize on either of these by having enemies dish out either pitiful or insane amounts of damage for a single blow. Each hit that drains a high heart count will invariably send the player back into the menu screen to heal, which is bad because we don't need any more reasons to be doing this. In past Zeldas, healing was often reserved for empty bottles, not unlike the finite healing reserves of Dark Souls' Estus Flask. In Ocarina and Majora, specifically, the rarity of death excused the dramatic death and rebirth cutscenes with fairies. Breath of the Wild's take on fairy revival is seamless, which is for the best, but it's curious that the rest of the healing system had to be so bogged down. In the game's mind, enemies have to be able to kill the player in a small number of hits because if they can't, the player won't be using their food to heal, making all of those items useless. But forcing the player to heal after 1 or 2 mistakes is forcing the player to navigate menus rather than enjoy the encounter. It slows fights to a crawl, driving the player to make trivial decisions like if they should eat an omelet with a buttered apple or some salty steak. To solve this, enemies should have been more aggressive, dealing more consistent but lower damage. Once you get about 10 hearts, you should be able to take on just about anything. The trouble is, you'll be taking not a lot of damage, just damage often enough that eventually you'll want to pause after a fight to heal up. An even easier way to solve this is to have a quick heal button as an optional replacement for the horse call. I didn't use horses much myself, but considering that there are places in which you cannot bring a horse, but there is no location in which you cannot heal, I think this is a fair suggestion. A quick heal would persuade the player to back up for a little bit of room for the second or so that it takes to heal. Like the fairies, it would be seamless. These are clear examples of how a very tiny bit of thought on the part of the developers would have made the experience infinitely more enjoyable for the player, but just isn't considered for some reason. You might say pausing the game to heal is a punishment for poor playing, but Zelda hasn't had a challenging combat system since 1987, with Zelda 2. Zelda's combat in the 3D titles is much more interesting in variety and theatrics, which is fine. It doesn't need to be like Dark Souls. But it does need to function. We'll talk about this again later, but let's resolve the rest of the UI first. The stamina wheel has rightfully been called out as a bane against the game. First, let's look at what stamina brings to the table and evaluate if that's worthwhile. You use stamina for running, climbing, attack charging, swimming, paragliding, and aiming while airborne. We do not need stamina for the last 3, because those actions are highly contextual. Wind Waker, if you remember, also had a stamina wheel, but it was only used for swimming, a specific action that needed to be present to keep players from swimming across the entire ocean. We, again, need that feature here. We do not, however, need it for running, climbing, or attack charging. Running is supposed to prevent the player from escaping from enemies, but oftentimes you can get away simply by walking, so I don't feel it is necessary here. Climbing is nothing more than an annoyance since there are many instances when I would almost, but not quite, reach a ledge, fall to the ground, and have to reclimb it, and this time refrain from jumping. This is quite literally the reincarnation of Kibora Gora's "Do you want to hear what I said again?" Seriously, what is the point? If you eat food to restore your stamina while hanging from a cliffside, then there's absolutely no sense in punishing the player for wanting to climb faster. I cannot fathom why this needed to be in the game, or why jumping has to punish the player by taking additional stamina. Timed jumps in rain make sense and should be the only time the player has to think about it. Beyond this, let them climb whatever they want and enjoy the scenery. You might think by making them climb slowly, you're giving them the chance to feel the journey of climbing a mountain. But the truth of it is the player is not taking in the environment at all. They're watching a green circle deplete instead. Attack charging is fine, but it doesn't need to involve a stamina meter, since you're immobilized while doing it anyways. There are so many more problems with the stamina wheel that it's hard to stop there. So I'm not gonna. The stamina wheel is smack in the center of the screen, even though countless other games put stamina meters in corners or edges. The obvious reason that they do this is so that it's something the player can briefly glance at if they want to, not because they need to constantly. Even if you want all 6 actions to be tied to stamina, it shouldn't be visible in Pro mode. The reason being is there are other ways to communicate low stamina. For instance, Link could leave sweat marks, like he already does, but you could take this further to have them splatter about dramatically when he's running low. His voice might change, he might become red in the face and his arms flail about excessively. This is the kind of gesture Nintendo is great at doing. It's baffling they didn't think of it this time around. Another issue I have is about upgrading it. Now, this would be a bigger change, but it would help the game in the long run, so bear with me. Upgrading stamina is an artificial time lengthener in more ways than one. It isn't a good upgrade, because where hearts mean you are able to access more difficult areas and challenge more difficult enemies, stamina upgrades are about bypassing unnecessary time sucks. So, assuming you do or do not include all 6 actions, the amount of stamina you should have as a universal base for your exploration needs is 1.5 if not 2 full green rings. Without stamina upgrades, you could replace all spirit orbs with heart pieces, which would cut down on a ton of time spent talking to goddess statues and receiving orbs. That's all well and good, but how does this affect the number of shrines we have? Well, to counteract this, you could adjust it so that 5 heart pieces are needed instead of 4. This would make it so that you'd only have to cut 5 shrines, which I think is fair. Alternatively, you could leave it at 4 pieces, which would bring us down to 92 shrines. And in this way, you could cut some of the more repetitive combat shrines and make exceptionally easy shrines as part of other shrines, or cut entirely. In either case, shrines will need to be just a little bit longer and more complex than they are. This would make them a little bit harder, a little bit less obvious to find, and overall bump up their quality. This brings me to another issue I had with the game's idea of hiding things. So let's talk about items and the Korokathon now. I really liked how creatures and items are labeled, or rather, hardly labeled at all. There are so many instances when a bug flies by my head and I realize that I can reach out and capture him. And I love that. Rather than standing out so harshly to the environment, these bugs feel just like actual bugs in the world. There are so many little knickknacks you can collect, and they all have a use. Really, multiple uses. And that I love too. I do not love, however, how the game has to stop and a pop-up tells me I found a gear by searching a guardian. When you pick up an item, it normally displays itself on the side of the screen, with a little sound. True, if I search something, I don't actually know what I'm going to get, but I'd certainly figure that out by seeing it pop up on the side of the screen, wouldn't I? Halting the game to display an item should only be reserved for new items, if at all. And to make it worse, I'm searching decayed guardians. What else am I expected to find other than gears? This isn't game breaking by any means, but sincerely, why all the fanfare over a spring? And yeah, Ocarina was guilty of this too with the Skulltula tokens, but they fixed this in Majora's Mask and beyond. So, why is it back now? Still, the best thing about these resources is instead of having what is usually a single function, that being a side quest, this time around you can use them to cook, upgrade armor, or even cast them in for Mon and get a bunch of cool shit. Look, I got a Shadow Link costume, for the first time ever. Talk about badass. But the real collectathon was not the resources. The new food and monster storage is actually the evolution of enemy drops from Wind Waker and empty bottle objects. While Breath of the Wild's take on resource management is much more robust and dynamic, its true collectathon, the Korok seeds, leave a great deal to be desired. There's only a half a dozen or so different ways to find Koroks, and once you solve the riddle to each one, then all future ones are also solved. The ones where you chase their sparkly trails or have to figure out where the next flower blooms are better. Again, when it makes you do something rather than think through something, the game feels natural and organic. But so many of them are just lifting a conspicuous rock. And there are literally hundreds of them. Jeez. But hey, I never find all the Skulltulas either. But what was rewarding about the Skulltulas was in how the game prompted you to be more conscientious of your surroundings, and to take guesses as to where a secret might be. They were a puzzle in observation. You also gained a reward after every 10. In Majora's Mask, you have mini-dungeons where you hunt 30 Skulltulas at once on a time limit, and you also have 15 fairies to find in each dungeon, also timed. And in all of these, rewards could have been anything, ranging from mass to extended magic meters. For my money, Majora's Mask nails it the best, isolating a location to a single hunt, and then getting creative with the placements of each one. Bottom line, what was fun about the collectathons in the old games was that it was about contemplating either where it might be, where it actually was, or in what you had to do to get it. In Breath of the Wild, there's none of this. After you've gotten about 30 or so, the whole gimmick is entirely predictable. So many times was I looking off at a lone tree in the distance thinking to myself, I want to go there, but I bet it's just a Korok seed, and that's not a good enough reward. So many times did I see a rock just lying around, and I thought, well, here's an enclosed space, what could be here? How about a seed? And I was always right because the game shows its cards without even trying to conceal them. I remember when Zelda had some mystique to it. You could tell your friends how you heard there was a Skulltula in a cave by a tree, how you have to play a mysterious song to reveal it. You could be watching a friend play Zelda 1 and say, hey, burn that bush, that one has rupees in it. And now it's like, go look up a map online, or else just walk around and it'll be given to you. People claim your experiences in this game are memorable because you own them, because the game isn't scripted. But I fail to see the significance in something so minuscule. The essence of the Korok seed is the same for the shrines. You spot them from a distance, which makes them a distraction rather than a discovery, and then you make the trip over to them and do a senseless task, which makes them a time waster. Here's how this could have been handled better. There are 900 Korok seeds to find, yes? Why not take a tip out of Majora's playbook and have either 90 or 180 caves hidden around the map, each of which would house either 10 or 5 Korok seeds respectively. Since there are less than 900, this will make them much better hidden, and have a greater reward also. Your incentive to explore a cave would go up too, because you wouldn't have to stick with strict numbers either. Some caves could have 3, others could have 13. Now a big side to this is I imagine they'd have to have a loading screen in between, which is bad, but like the shrines, you can buffer this by making them long enough to warrant it. It would be ideal if the caves were a seamless part of the world, The benefits of such a system is that finding a cave really would feel like discovering a secret, if for no other reason than the fact that the Koroks won't be shoved into every conceivable nook and cranny of the map. Perhaps a more minor element, but I found the system to be very intrusive. It's constantly sidetracking you into doing a task you already know how to do to get something that very quickly becomes hardly worth it. And again, like the shrines, it wouldn't be a big deal if they only reused ones like chasing flowers or running to catch sparkly trails, since these are things that get the player engaged. The difference between a nice distraction and a nuisance. It just so happens that a great many of the excess Korok seeds were under a rock or in 3 perfectly aligned trees that just happened to grow in the exact same way, multiple times over across the globe. Or in statues with missing apples, and there's literally no variation to any of these. I reiterate, the older games understood what a secret was. That was the point of Zelda 1. Side questing isn't much better either, I'm afraid. In Ocarina, hunting down and catching all 10 big Poes for an empty bottle, horse racing to win a horse, and navigating a tomb to learn a melody are all vastly different activities with unique aesthetics, gameplay, and rewards, and all of them relate to the narrative experience in some way. The big Poes are sold to a creepy vendor who's taken up shop in the ruins of Castletown, a neutral party at best and a Ganon supporter at worst. Rescuing Epona shows how an individual who felt undervalued could have a change of status provided he was willing to align himself with a corrupt leader. The Sun Song you learn in the Royal Tomb allows you to change the time from day to night, but it also can be used to paralyze Redeads and Gibdoos, which will be invaluable in late game. The best examples of side quests in Breath of the Wild are the Hunt for Link's Memories, where your intuition and exploratory spirit mean everything. This was executed well, I tip my hat. The shrine riddles were mixed, more often than not far too easy, or in some cases a carbon copy of what was done in previous games. What's more is the rewards for doing these is the same as it was the time before it, and even if you get a cool weapon by exploring, that weapon can break. But even if it didn't, it has duplicates, so it's not a lucky find. It's just another flame sword. It wasn't just another song that you found in that tune. And to top it off, there's hardly any tonal variety to any of them. When you compare solving a shrine riddle for a bewildered bird to something like the Keaton Mask quest in Majora, it's pretty clear which one is more interesting. Perhaps not a fair comparison, but all I need to do is cherry pick to knock down the papier-mâché foundation Breath of the Wild is built upon. How about the soldier who was invisible in desperate need of medicine? He's a foreshadow of what ghostly trials lie ahead in Ikana Valley. Some of the shrine quests like those in the Lost Woods and the desert were more enjoyable to play through than many like them in past entries. But the substance behind them is routinely weak, because it's as if no one is supposed to know of the shrine's existence at all. But I get ahead of myself. The last thing we need to cover is the combat directly. So let's do that now, and I want a whole section dedicated to it. It's interesting to think about how huge of a role combat has had in the early titles, and how it has maintained its simplicity but removed the high difficulty throughout the years, most notably in the 3D titles. I can understand why Ocarina of Time was easy, because they were concerned with overburdening the player since navigating a 3D environment was new for everyone at the time. And I suppose I can let Wind Waker slide as well, since that one had a more cartoon aesthetic. But by the time Twilight Princess came around, and you're basically invincible from the moment the game begins. Look at this guy. He's never gonna hurt me. I'm happy to say that Breath of the Wild takes our heart containers seriously for a change. I liked that enemies can kill me in a single hit. I like that enemies make attempts to actually hit me at all. It's very refreshing. So let's note that the combat, like many things, is a step forward in a positive direction. I even like how hits that would ordinarily kill you leave you with a quarter heart. It's an artificial second chance, but I welcome it. Don't get me wrong, as a huge Souls fan and a fan of NES Zelda, I like challenging games. I just don't think excessive challenge is as important in Breath of the Wild since the aesthetic is far more tranquil and relaxed. and because 3D Zeldas have made a point to be more interested in puzzle difficulty rather than combat. I'd like a truly dynamic, challenging combat system in a Zelda game, but I don't expect it, nor do I hold it against any of those titles. When I critiqued the shrine puzzles earlier, I did so because solving puzzles by accident is not something I've ever encountered in a Zelda title before, to my knowledge. Breath of the Wild fails to provide adequate puzzles, outside of perhaps Divine Beast Naboris. But it is nice to see some effort put into the combat, so I'll take it. Now I have to note this weird thing that I think someone will have an answer for. Link's attack animations all look fine, however there's this odd motion that happens when you charge your sword. His arm will first go to one position and then snap into another, and there's hardly anything there to indicate the movement. Not a big deal, but I kept thinking about it throughout my first playthrough and I decided to mention it since, if you'll remember, in previous entries, Link would pull his arm back behind him in one smooth motion. Seriously, if anyone has an explanation for this, I'd appreciate hearing it. Some weapons don't have this problem, but your basic sword always does. Not a big deal. I just don't understand why 1998 Zelda didn't have this quirk, and yet 2017 Zelda does? What's more is, if you attack once and then go into a charge, Link will charge the weapon in the new position and spin in the reverse direction, which is a nice touch. And all the more perplexing why it excels above and beyond here, and yet falls short elsewhere. Anyways, I digress. The combat. Enemies no longer wait around for you to cut them to pieces. As I said, a much needed change. They are far more likely to shoot you with an arrow, throw something at you, or come charging with an onslaught of weapons and horses. Enemies also come in various colors to represent difficulty, which was a technological limitation of before, but is a lovable aesthetic now. So yes, the combat is solid, very enjoyable in fact. One of my favorite moments in Breath of the Wild was when I ran into this enemy encampment, and I had a blast fighting them all in the crazy frenzy that it was. The basics are all here, and I'm more or less content with it, though it still needs refinement for the next entry. In terms of enemy variety, it's not great. The moblins, the Lizafos, their skeleton counterparts, I wasn't very far into the game before they all started to blend together. Each one boils down to some slightly different number values and a gimmick. The Lizafos are faster, so you have to react quicker. The skeletons will crumble when hit, and then you have to take out the head before they reassemble. And that's about it. It also throws some very difficult enemies at you pretty early on. I don't mind this, in fact I welcome it, but usually when you do this it's an indicator that you're in the wrong place. When the skeletons in the graveyard repeatedly kill you in Dark Souls, it's the game's way of telling the player they're going in the wrong direction. But you know, your funeral. Breath of the Wild instead is more about the chaotic nature of the post-apocalyptic world, I suppose. Beyond enemies, I might have preferred a shield bash instead of a parry. Because it's far easier to do, and the combat doesn't need to be like Dark Souls. Simple is okay. It just needs to give the player some options and variety. But I won't delay the inevitable any longer. The real topic we have to address is of course the durability system. You knew this was coming. First off, we need to mention the limitation of movesets. All the weapons attack within 3 different categories, rather than each having its own unique fighting style like in the Soul series. This means when you pick up a new weapon, it is extremely intuitive to use, which is good. That said, when people argue that the brittle weapons work to the game's advantage because it encourages the player to try different tactics, using weapons that are more optimal in certain situations or against certain enemies rather than others, that argument falls flat on its face when you realize that every weapon attacks the exact same way. What's the point of deciding what weapon to use if they're all the same? What little variation the game does offer, swinging a sword slowly, and poking people, is hardly enough to create compelling strategic thinking. You pick up weapons, you smack the enemies, and you call it a day. That's been working for Zelda for years, and it's been in service to the puzzle solving, which was fine by most of us. Evermore, the game isn't difficult enough to warrant excessive strategic use of the brittle weapons. If it truly was challenging to overcome these enemies, I would consider which weapons I use more carefully, but it isn't, so it doesn't matter, and you instead weigh your decisions not on what would be optimal, but what you can make yourself content with losing. I imagine this system performed much better in the Trials of the Sword DLC, because it certainly thrives well on the Island Shrine Quest, which was one of the rare great moments Breath of the Wild had to offer, and frankly didn't do nearly enough of. Outside of settings where there was nothing but a handful of brittle equipment to tug a war over with the bokoblins, the only tactics that I could see myself doing was in complementing the melee barrage with arrows, a completely different category of tools with its own inventory slots and which worked very well. and elemental attacks, which are add-ons that don't alter moveset. But when you do that, you walk into yet another problem. Watch me fight this Guardian Scout. Why don't you start counting how frequently I'm having to pause the action? The rhythm of the fight takes an absolute nosedive if you intend to use multiple weapons. There aren't combos for something like freezing then burning an enemy, which is good because Lord knows we don't need another reason to pause the game and shift through the menu. But it's also bad because some of these enemies take forever to kill. Even getting fast at it doesn't help. Constantly pausing the game, having the music volume lower, it just kills the frantic exhilaration you would ideally feel from a tense encounter. By giving the weapons elemental effects, I wanted to preserve their usage, which I had to force myself to stop doing because it kept hurting the action. Maybe that's a flaw with how I play these games, but combat in past Zelda was neutral at worst and theatrical at best. With it making the transition to a more dynamic and thoughtful combat system, it should have taken more pointers out of games that do this well, instead of floundering around committing the same notorious sin the Water Temple did with the Iron Boots. Again, something that affected a single dungeon, not pervading the entire game. And Breath of the Wild is only vaguely less offensive in that loading the menu is faster than it was in Ocarina. Not only are breakable and largely unrepairable weapons a complete sure way of undermining their value, but I compare again. When you find a weapon in Dark Souls, it's unique, because each have their own movesets. If Breath of the Wild actually embraced the survivalist motif it dabbles with, we wouldn't need or indeed benefit at all from having unique movesets. But the truth is, it is far more interested in being a power fantasy, a style in which personalization is hugely important. It's like they took a gimmick from an actual Zelda game, The Wind Waker, and made its picking up enemy weapons the main course of a game masquerading as Zelda. Are you seeing yet how the brittle weapons fit into the philosophy of hybrid play? Every time you pick up Breath of the Wild on your Nintendo Switch, you find something new, a new shrine, a new place, a new weapon, a Korok seed, and so on. They're designed to break, just as shrines are meant to complete quickly so that you're forced into having a fresh experience each time you pick up the console. Every trip to Hyrule is always a successful venture. Nintendo, intentionally or not, is dumbing down and shredding up systems give the player a fleeting sense of surprise at the cost of genuine investment. It's the equivalent of someone giving you a gift every single day, except the gift is a jelly bean that'll perish before the day ends if you don't eat it. Why not stop giving me disposable candy and just come to the beach with me, or play cards? Spend time together and have fun. The system in place is suffocating, and the game's solutions to it are bizarre. You can expand your inventory only after exploring every nook and cranny for the Korok seeds, of which get pricier not overall but just within the category you're most interested in, which means you're probably going to get more of something you don't really need. Or you can buy a house and get a couple of mounts and a loading screen to retrieve them. I'll use my house for decoration purposes, to be honest. Or you can spend a diamond in repairing a select few weapons in the game. Or you can chuck, again, a select few into the mouth of an Octorok. I appreciate how secretive and inventive this idea is, but the only place to accomplish this is to warp to Death Mountain. No weapon's durability is worth preserving for that long. So let's brainstorm, and for right now, let's just stay within the realm of practical solutions, something that could have been accomplished within, say, 6 months before release, or with a small update. I think they should keep the system exactly as it is. Sincerely. But we just add 3 unique blacksmiths that provide special service. If you have 2 or more copies of the same weapon, you can fuse them together at a blacksmith, giving them a very slight boost in damage, durability, and most importantly, doing this frees up a weapon slot. This won't be free. In fact, in addition to rupees, you will also need to provide ore, which will vary depending on the weapon. Not only are we now on the way of pleasing people who would like to get attached to their weapons, a way to do so, but we've also created another use for the ore, a resource that was a little underutilized in comparison with other items, honestly. We're going to put the first of these blacksmiths in Hento Village, since it would be useful to have stored weapons in your home you might want to forge with. But there's a catch. This blacksmith only works with weapons like broadswords and claymores, anything man-made. But that's why there's also a big Goron on Death Mountain, who is particularly fascinated with guardian weapons, who can forge those. Or perhaps one of those hip inventors could have a forgery if we have to have the squidlets in the game. And somewhere in the dark corners of the map is a cave hidden behind the thicket. You burn it down and enter to find a friendly moblin who says, "It's a secret to everyone." This blacksmith is a nice callback to Zelda 1, and he deals in the monster weapons you find. With each fusion, the increase in damage and durability is lessened, but by maxing it out, which is going to require even more rare ore like star fragments and dragon scales, you can achieve a permanent weapon. The weapon will break but remain in your inventory, like the Master Sword, but you'll need to bring it back to the blacksmith for repair. The repair will cost you a pretty penny, but since it's maxed out, it will last much longer. Each weapon would also have its own thresholds. A soldier's broadsword can probably only be combined 3 times and wouldn't need anything elaborate like a dragon scale to get to that point. But it's not a very strong weapon anyways. The royal broadsword, on the other hand, will probably take 6 or 7 fusions and cost you quite a lot. And while it won't rival the Master Sword in damage or range, it will compensate against many other weapons in durability. You could even have something like the Traveler's Sword as always pretty weak, but it will stand out from the other swords in that it can attain one of the highest durability ratings in the game, assuming you can find 10 of them, however. Like Dark Souls, each weapon would have its own perk that sets it apart from the others. Even the petty junk you find early on could serve you well down the line, making each weapon a viable option to consider depending on how you play and what your needs are. I think this system would fit nicely with what's already in place. Once the player figures out that one weapon is always the base in the forging, and that this base keeps whatever bonus it comes with, and factoring in that the weapon will still break, the player can then strategize for their preferences. They'll save their Zora blades until they find one with a durability plus perk to use as their base, because that's going to be their main offensive weapon. And Zora blades have weight-based durability. They're a big fan of thunder-based weapons though, so they pick up some thunder blades and some ferocious scales. Then you need a heavy hitting weapon, so you start hunting down Lynels and collect their savage blades until you get one with a damage plus boost. You can't tell me this kind of customization wouldn't fit this game when you have multiple costumes, many of which offer very negligible differences, a dye shop, and a myriad of resources, many of which are rare to upgrade said armor. Alternatively, I could simply interpret the brittle weapons as a lesson in nihilism. But given how possessive you can be with armor, I'm far more inclined to consider it the worst kind of quantity over quality. That being the salesman who has 1,000 things to sell, all of them shiny, and all of them will be completely faded after a day in the sun. I think my idea would have kept the underlying pick up and find freshness mentality they were going for, while simultaneously giving those sitting with the game for long hours on end some things to work towards. Goals! I filled half my inventory with royal broadswords because I wanted something simple and easy to rely on for when I made the trip out to Hyrule Castle. But I never got around to using them. If I could have combined the blades into one, it would have freed up my inventory and I would have been encouraged to actually use more weapons in the game. I'd have had the space for them. I'd have spent my precious resources on my favorite weapons and left the rest to be replaceable throughout the expedition. I don't know who else did this, but I'm certainly not alone in that once I got the Master Sword, I ended up using it exclusively, unless it was recharging. This would be the same thing except you'd have more weapons to switch to, which is what I think many people mistakenly believe the developers intended. The combat, like a lot of things in this game, it's half-baked. We have nothing but the most backwards limited methods for repairing our gear, a parry feature that rarely does anything a backflip couldn't solve and be more viable to do, and a quirky arm glitch every time we charge our weapon. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad some consideration was put into the combat. I'm glad they made a variety of weapons. I'm glad they brought back the challenge. I'm glad they took a chance and changed it up. I see a lot of creativity, and hell, it can be fun to just go out and mess around with stuff. I just have to be honest when I say I really don't think the system was fleshed out. I think they failed to cater to the audience of RPG fans who do play Zelda, where our progression and loot discovery mean a great deal. And it's like, they have progression, the heart containers, armor upgrades, and champion spells. Why were the weapons overlooked? Well, I'll tell you why. It's artificially making the game reward the player for just picking it up and playing for 10 minutes. And then by having it new every time, the experience feels constantly fresh. I see through the psychological manipulation, and I'm not buying it. You don't earn any of these cool weapons. They don't have value that another weapon couldn't already do for you, and they're not memorable in their own right because there are duplicates of them all. When you find the Aido in Dark Souls, or the Titanite catch pole drops from a tough enemy, not only does that weapon have at least a few special moves akin to its own, but there's a method to acquiring it that is memorable. Imagine if you started up a new game of Breath of the Wild and outlined a map of all the Guardian Spears in the game, then went out to get them. Not only do you have a fun challenge, but it'd be like a treasure hunt. This isn't even that much more work for the developers. They made the weapon system what it is. Like the stamina wheel, you don't have to like it just because you like the rest of the game. The Master Sword is the only special weapon in the game. But it is already special because it's the only sword that can cast a projectile, glows blue when you fight guardians, and is riding on 27 years of nostalgia. More durability doesn't make it special. On top of all that, you even have this moment where you have to cast away your hearts as you relinquish the blade. It's a nice cinematic and narrative gesture, and it is one of the few homages to the original Zelda that is truly comprehensive. In case you don't remember, in Zelda 1, you needed to have a certain number of heart containers. Then you had to walk to an old man who would ask you to master using it, and you could have it. Presumably more hearts meant you'd been in more battles, and this show of dedication would grant you a new sword. The explanation in Breath of the Wild is different, but mechanically it's the same thing. And we haven't seen this idea since Zelda 1. I started pulling the sword up and I was like, oh nice, that's clever. And it was, and it is. But before I get into my final subject, I want to stay on this little high note and talk about probably the most standout part of the entire game. With the exception of Zelda 2 and Skyward Sword, Koji Kondo has been the lead composer behind every major Zelda title. That means the palace themes from Zelda 2 are arguably the only beloved iconic Zelda themes not written by Koji Kondo. So it is quite the surprise that the score for Breath of the Wild holds up so well. But I admit, I might just be a sucker in this regard. Breath of the Wild's score sometimes feels like the only part of the game that the fans are in debate on. Even people who love it are sometimes mixed, and I can see why. Like everything else, it's a huge departure, relying far more on subtle piano and ambience than on iconic Zelda themes. I can understand where people are coming from when Hyrule Field used to sound like this. And now sounds like this. And yet, if there is a change to the Zelda formula that's justified, it's the music. It takes a back seat, gently easing you into wandering around the overworld. It would have gotten very old very quickly to have the Hyrule Field theme bombarding the player every time they make a quick jog. Not only that, but I was worried the score would have dramatic shifts in personality throughout, and while it does incorporate other instruments later, it never strays too far from the simplistic piano echoing in the distance. That feeling of distance mirrors how you'll look out over the world in awe and wonder. I'm also quite biased for ambient music, especially in games, I freely admit. Who knew an ambient approach would have fared so well, though? My favorite track has to be Mountain. This one totally immersed me into the game, frequently making me stop and gaze around me in wonder. Usually the cave theme in a Zelda title ranks among my top 5, and this one, for different reasons, is no exception. Mystery, beauty, I love it. Some other standout tracks for me are found within the smallest places, like Kara Bazaar. First time I heard this track, I was awestruck. Why do they put so much effort into making this track for a non-warpable location you only have to visit once? I mean, I'm not complaining, it's a great track, deeply evocative, very nice indeed. It's just surprising. It's going that extra mile. And there are other memorable tracks also, like take Death Mountain for instance. For whatever reason, this simple beat makes me feel like I'm back on the NES. It is similar with the horse riding music, which makes me feel like I can see Zelda herself trotting through the fields on horseback. We even get a rendition of Wind Waker's Dragon Roost Island, but I'm getting out of control now, so let's just talk about the tracks that have narrative importance. Now let's not forget that Zelda music has had one element that has been less than stellar for years: the battle music. No offense to Mr. Conjo, but the battle music in 3D Zeldas have been nearly impossible to connect with. I mean, listen to this nonsense. Just terrifying. But now, we got this. Whether or not you can jam to it, you have to admit it's much more complex, and its use of percussion, those little clicks in the background, the rhythmic bounce. I'm not a musician, which I'm sure is obvious, but what I can say is there is music here, and it's high energy with a lot of different instruments coming together to put in their 2 cents. It has personality, and we even get multiple renditions for different fights. I'm partial to the Molduga battle theme myself. Something about strings just feels perfect for Zelda battle music to me. There are a handful of tech beeps and bloops for the sci-fi elements of the game, and while none of these tracks resonate with me, I blame the choice to have sci-fi themed anything rather than the music, which does its best to make the two worlds merge smoothly, to the little avail it is. One argument you could make against this course direction is that very little of it is befitting of an apocalypse. But the original was in many ways an apocalypse also, and that music was heroic in the overworld. And it was so because despite being overrun with monsters, the focus was on Link's triumphing efforts over that. This would then contrast itself with the dungeon theme, and in particular Ganon's theme. Breath of the Wild doesn't have proper dungeons, so when it does try to implement darker themes, it fails to immerse me when I can just look outside and see the tranquil nature of the world. The contrast doesn't work if the two are synergized into the same space. It only worked in past Zelda titles because dungeons dominated the environment and your mental space for what was usually an hour or more, and at least 30 minutes on subsequent playthroughs. That's a good amount of time so that when you finally do resurface from the darkness and the challenges, a heroic melody is a great way to encourage our spirits and create an attachment with our achievements. Breath of the Wild favors more soothing melodies for its overworld though, which would likely make players want to go to sleep after one of the Divine Beasts, since both the dungeon and overworld tracks are somber. The overworld melodies are better as a soothing piece, however, since bombastic marches would not only get stale very quickly, as it does in Hyrule Castle, but would also completely misinterpret the peaceful bond with nature that the game is interested in. In other words, I enjoyed the approach very much. But we also have the shrines, and here is where the music shifts away from the ambient dungeon crawl themes of the past, yet they do so with good reason. While I initially had mixed feelings about this track for getting too loud for a dungeon or a cave, I ultimately learned to love it because it turns the shrines into a cataclysmic event that is in sharp contrast with the subdued overworld themes. Despite a mixed reception from fans, the new composers emulated the harsh juxtaposition of different moods that Zelda has been subtly doing all along. In a reversal of tradition, the shrine theme is epic and loud, and the overworld themes are subdued and quiet. 3D Zeldas have always done the opposite. I think it would have been too easy to assume that just because a shrine is kind of like a dungeon, it should have a more ambient track to facilitate the player's puzzle solving. A space that is a potential frustration, and in which the music can become a source of distaste if the player is perpetually unsuccessful in solving. In past games, the subtlety of the music helped ease us into the problem-solving mindset, and reduced frustration as a result. The designers of Breath of the Wild made these puzzles much too easy for long, frustrating sessions to ever manifest, but the composers are nonetheless commendable for doing their part, almost in tandem with them. They, I think, deliberately gave themselves the freedom to be big and booming because they could trust that the player wouldn't be listening to it without breaks. Besides, there is some puzzle solving to be had, and unlike the dungeon themes of yore, this track needed to encapsulate not only that thinking and tinkering space, but also of being tested, being watched and evaluated. Then you have the Sheikah lore, that sense of loss. This is what's become of those who failed again 100 years ago. And by conquering the shrine, you're reclaiming a little bit of what was once lost. This track does not feel gimmicky in the slightest. Unlike the Rito theme, the Shrine theme never dips into a moment of silliness. Plain as that might be to say, it's true. The Shrine theme keeps things building with the repeated use of the strings, its gradual introduction of new instruments until the music just explodes. It's deep, and the perfect blend of a rite of passage and a triumph over the grief of long-lost people. And while I sometimes feel Breath of the Wild doesn't do enough to be remembered, the Shrine theme is certainly pulling its weight in that respect. It puts all the aesthetics together. The whole premise of Hyrule lying in waiting, blood moons rising, and then the champion awakens, strides forward from one's 100-year slumber. With the odds stacked against him this time and a loss on the scoreboard, the pressure is on to do the impossible. Ganon has Hyrule, and if you want to take it back, you're going to be alone, and that means you need to be ready. There won't be anyone left to lay you back to rest this time. That's where the narrative shines the most for me, in the shrines. I didn't care for how the visual design, the whole tech theme, the shortness of them, but the idea that's conveyed in the music, it speaks really strong. Changing up dungeons from being temples of evil or holy places corrupted to a secret rite, the proving grounds, I love that stuff. Kind of a remix of the Tower of the Gods from Wind Waker. Zelda games have never had complex narratives, but the best of them intertwine themselves with themes to carry the legwork. I mentioned before how Ocarina is about the loss of childhood, how adulthood brings with it many trials and harsh realities that only adult Link faces. The original Zelda had virtually none of this, and sure, it didn't need it, but Breath of the Wild aims for that sweet spot between the two. I love how the main narrative is told through a cutscene and a handful of optional cinematics. Again, it's not a deep story, but that's okay. When it touches upon those ideas, a hero once fallen having to climb and crawl his way back from the grave and prove himself against the ancients, it's great. Classic underdog stuff. You awaken and are literally breathed back to life by the call of the wild. What chance do you think you have? But you don't have a choice. Everyone else has fallen, and the blood moon hangs over us all. Of course, sometimes the impact of all this is lessened quite a bit when you find people carrying on day to day without much of a care about Ganon. I mean, again, you could just leave Ganon alone, but no, you gotta go there and disturb him, settle the score. Except it's not very personal this time around. Not only are you not bested by Ganon specifically the first time, but there's no exchange between the two of you. Calamity Ganon, same difference. What are we gonna call him? Super Voldemort in the future? Calamity Ganon is basically some cybernetic spider with a big beard? Alright. Then you go outside and the light emanating off of him is just relentless. It hurts your eyes to look at. Dark Beast Ganon? Dark? And he doesn't even do anything. Apparently this is just a glorified QuickTime event. But to be frank with you, because I haven't done enough of that this video, for a game that claims to be so open, so free and accepting of how you want to play and what you want to do, to then squeeze you into this narrow tube at the very end left a bad pit in my stomach. Traditionally in 3D Zelda, there's a moment where you deliver the final blow, and sometimes the fight itself is more of a formality, but you can always get into the theatrics of it and play along. It's always functional enough to be satisfying. But this one was just completely underwhelming and painfully obvious that the AI wasn't even trying. I appreciate the choice to make Ganon solely a monster again, one you can't converse with, like the original, but you don't feel the consequences of what he's done. You don't get a real final confrontation with him, and he starts to feel like a pest, like a really big insect snuck into your house. Not even Zelda herself seems the slightest bit psychologically damaged despite the alleged defilement for 100 years. How the hell can anyone forgive this final encounter? It's literally writing in your investment in Zelda to appreciate it, where other games have to work 100 times harder to impress. Like, get a load of this, and you tell me this isn't badass. That's how you do it. You know, I was talking with a friend of mine, and he was saying that Ocarina depicts Ganon very well because of the lighting. Not only does it make for a good climactic battle, but the darkness helps shroud what would otherwise be a very aged 3D model. Also listen for how Zelda screams when Ganon slashes you. It's these little touches, the ones that made this moment so unforgettable, that keeps Ocarina as a classic. Nowadays, graphics are far more realistic and we have much more control over them. You don't need to think about how to sell a big scary monster, but it'd be nice if you cared to make the moment special. It doesn't make sense to have a house of horrors at the bottom of a town's drinking well, but what that does offer to the game's narrative symbolism and the player's imagination is well worth the price of nonsensicalness. Dead Hand, Ganon, the Forest Temple, these are some of Ocarina's best moments, and they are so because it's something all of us experienced. We share a bond in having dealt with those monsters together, overcome the horrors. We know the weight of their significance. Breath of the Wild's philosophy, as it is with many modern games, is that each playthrough is different for everyone in incredibly negligible ways. To accomplish this, the content is heavily dispersed, not well paced, and with little attention to detail. Playing Breath of the Wild might be fun, it controls better, but it won't survive in my memories. Thus far, I've only touched upon the Divine Beasts and the bosses, but it's time to talk about them in depth. Dungeons are my favorite part of a Zelda game, as I've said before, but what I enjoy most about them is in how they are intrinsically linked with the main quest. Even the original, while not using elemental themes, still had various color palettes and specific enemy types and combinations to make each dungeon feel distinct from one another. The Forest Temple is that first real trial, the proving grounds. You're an adult and you've returned home to find it more horrific than you could have imagined. The Stone Tower Temple is so high above the world, and your perception of reality is warped just being in its presence. It's otherworldly, and it's those thematic undertones that ultimately held my interest in the long term for these games. Not the puzzles, not the combat. Themed dungeons have been around since Zelda 1. Those themes do not have to be based off of the elements, but they do need distinction from one another. The Divine Beasts are none of these things, since they all follow the same visual format, and have no narrative progression among each other. They're not even thematically compelling in their own right. There's one or two randomly placed enemies in each one, which makes you wonder why it wasn't exclusively a puzzle. And while the gimmick of rotating the beasts was interesting in terms of gameplay, they were short, each boss was an incarnation of a threat that had no interest in bothering anyone, and on top of all this, they were open to the outside world. So you never felt like you were descending, ascending, or shifting through an ancient palace. Immersion was impossible. The tech demo vibe was this constant nag. While it's good for the team to take a breath of fresh air, pun, this just sucks. Hyrule Castle is often lauded as being much better than the Beasts, but I'd argue even that fell flat. Hyrule Castle can, like everything in this game, be basically skipped entirely, and you don't even need to try very hard. There are no keys or thresholds that can't just outright be avoided. You can still view the outside world, huge chunks of the keep are optional, and the music is a marching assault theme rather than a more ambient track to suit the more deep contemplation of a puzzle solver. It's so loud and booming, you want to push to the top as fast as possible instead of exploring and enjoying the space. I didn't even know about the lower level of this place where the Hylian shield was until I had finished the game. When I went back and discovered it, I was in shock that such a classic item would be so accessible from the beginning, but Link's hat had to be locked behind 120 shrines? A hat? You might say Hyrule Castle was better because the theatrics were stronger. I might agree with that. Making my way up to the castle gate, avoiding the guardians, and putting all my resources and skills to the test was decent. But once I got into the castle, it became immediately apparent that everything I had done for those 120 shrines and 4 divine beasts was completely meaningless, since I could have come here with 3 hearts, picked up some good equipment, and saved myself the extra trouble. Which is exactly what I did on my second playthrough. And look, I appreciate how open the game is. I like that Hyrule Castle is accessible for the veterans who think they're up for it right at the start. But the game just goes way too far with this idea, to the point where nothing seems worth doing at all. If there were a series of Lionels, Guardians, and Black Moblins to fight on the way up to Ganon, preferably in rooms locked behind key doors that must be walked through, the problem would be solved, since players at the very least would be encouraged to upgrade their equipment to a reasonably high level and pick up some stronger weapons for those first few fights. But that would be how traditional Zelda has handled things, and God forbid we borrow any ideas from those masterpieces. I don't know how to reconcile the enormous praise this game has gotten, since everything this game does is a deliberate departure and all too frequently with such little substance, that I finished the game and had no interest in replaying it whatsoever. All of this, and for what? The reason Ocarina of Time is worth revisiting isn't because it has a great combat system, but it's not nearly as horrible as everyone says, or because tutorials are skippable, because they aren't, or because the game is challenging, because largely it isn't. The reason Ocarina is worth playing is because of the narrative themes that contextualize the events of the game. You undergo a journey. Facing off against Ganon remains one of the most memorable moments of any video game because of how much you go through to earn the right to fight him. Furthermore, the fight is foreshadowed on numerous occasions throughout the experience, giving players much appreciated feedback as to how their progression is affecting the world or the people in it. You see what Ganon has done with the world. You witness the stakes simply by playing. You fight through every dungeon, awakening the sages because you will need their help to seal away this great evil. In Breath of the Wild, you can skip all this. Who cares about building tension anyways? And in theory, this is so that we can aspire to the true, good style that games should be. Let it all be seamless and by the player's choice. Believe me, I am for both of these. They're a huge reason I love the Souls series so much. Don't interrupt gameplay, and let my character's decisions be my own. But there has to be some purpose for why I would want to return to your world. When you revisit areas in Ocarina that are now clearly suffering from Ganon's reign, you are able to ease some of their pain, and you're all the more motivated to dethrone Ganon because things will never be like they were with him holding so much power. I think we forget that Ocarina of Time does let the player witness their actions before them without hand-holding. And yes, it does use cutscenes, but so does Breath of the Wild. Even if you decide to do the Divine Beasts, you marginally improve the attitudes and beliefs of a handful of NPCs, and that's pretty much it. Living in a frozen state is a severe problem. Excessive rain is just bad weather. And they're fish! Fish! Talk about low stakes! Too much water? Zelda 1 may not have been narrative focused in the same way as the 3D titles, but what it offered instead was the dungeon crawl, weighing possibilities and resources as you put your skills to the test. Players had to navigate a series of labyrinths while simultaneously taking inventory of how far they could push themselves, as the combat was ever testing. Breath of the Wild is not like the 3D Zeldas in that the story has been regulated to fit into bite-sized chunks which disrupt on what would be an otherwise organic flow. But it also doesn't have deep, elaborate dungeons or a nuanced or challenging combat system either. While the combat is marginally better than most 3D titles before it, it doesn't carry much weight against powerhouses like the Souls series. The original would force you to the start of the dungeon if you died, and you'd probably end up leaving to stock up on potions and supplies before making another attempt, and this errand time means your memory of the labyrinth will take a hit. In other 3D titles, you can make an easy straight shot for the boss on most occasions, but that's just it. It is extremely difficult to die in 3D Zelda boss fights, since they're largely there as a theatric. This worked for the most part. Most of the challenge came from navigating the dungeon, so the bosses serve a more aesthetic role than a combat challenge. It's permissible. You got your challenge. 3D Zeldas have only rarely been about combat. Upon reflection from my second playthrough, one element I have changed my stance on is the execution of the Lost Woods. Navigating through it is exciting and challenging, far more engaging than Ocarina and the original. What I would have liked from it was if it was reliant on clues and tips from NPCs and quests throughout the world, or within the woods itself. That would have captured the true essence of the original, which had us spreading rumors and tips of methods to solve the mystery. But in hindsight, I recognize that what is here is one of the better Lost Woods encounters, and I want to be sure that what I'm doing is asking for reasonable things. In other words, what I would have wanted is a bit grand, but the other things I bring up are backed up by games that have already accomplished the feat within the Zelda series. Although, of the Lost Woods, I still retain that the best of these is, perhaps an unpopular opinion, but Death Mountain from Zelda 2. Despite its ludicrous difficulty, Death Mountain does all the right things you could ever want in a maze. You enter sort of mini-challenges. In this game it's combat, but you could substitute puzzles as well. Every time you take a chance on one of multiple directions available, it doesn't put you back to the beginning. It sends you forward, punches you in the memory gland, and pops you out where you started from the other end. At the end of this, you get a new item and a stat upgrade, 2 rewards for 1 lofty price. But Breath of the Wild, as I said, is by no means the worst Lost Woods. One of the better executions, I have to admit. What I think I don't like about it is it sections off the real meat of the forest into optional sequences, which just kill the excitement I might have had from finding the Master Sword. You see how the game is just so horrified at the possibility of you failing, that it couldn't even let you earn the discovery of the Master Sword? At the end of it was the Deku Tree, droning on about the Master Sword and what I have to do to proceed through the game, and yeah, whatever, been there, done that. Would someone explain to me why the Deku Tree is here, what significance he brought to the story or the world? The Deku Tree in Ocarina is certainly much more annoying on subsequent playthroughs, but it's undeniable that they contribute a great deal. He represents a father to the Kokori children, and is destroyed by Ganon. This makes Ganon a real threat, as you literally watch the Deku Tree, a great spirit of the forest, gradually die before your eyes. It is also a thematic closure for Link, the death of the Elder and thus the start of one's journey, reluctant as they may be. It's the same as the original Star Wars with the death of Luke's aunt and uncle. And what's more, it also serves as a symbol for the death of childhood, which is a huge theme in Ocarina of Time. And nothing of the sort is found here. He's just like, oh hey Link, welcome back, pull the sword, be a hero. I would have rather have him cut in favor of time spent doing something that would have benefited this game. I mean, they cut Goma and Dodongo, and in favor of what? The Deku Tree? Retreading the same bosses over and over again? Why not have 4 boss monsters who are loyal to Ganon for each divine beast? Bring back Aquamentus, someone. It's an omission that makes no sense for Zelda tradition, and only hurts this game's own interests. The US is known as a self-esteem culture, meaning we see personal failure as an attack on our self-esteem, and immediately proceed to get away from the stressor. This is in stark contrast with Japan, a self-improvement model. They tend to see failure as an opportunity to improve themselves. This is why Dark Souls is a true Japanese take on a Western RPG. It is solely concerned with the player character instead of a story, just like US RPGs, but it follows the improvement model. People don't like to play Souls games because they're hard, and they'd rather not put in the time when it's easier to blame the game for being too difficult. It hurts your self-esteem when you die, and you don't want that. But you don't feel confident you can succeed, so the only thing to do is to get that away. And this isn't just a negative. Some people simply don't want their gaming entertainment to be challenging, and that's okay. Life is hard enough. But nevertheless, it's still a self-esteem model. Breath of the Wild is similarly a Japanese take on the Western open world. But rather than hold true to its values, as Dark Souls has done, it instead abandons every part of its identity, fully adopting an esteem model, afraid players will get bored too quickly, afraid to ask them to puzzle solve or strategize. I said it before, I reiterate, it's insecure, constantly throwing shit in my face. Gyro controls, self-promotion, bright colors, motorcycles, and all its supposed inspiration from past games are brought in for the novelty of it, not to make for enriching gameplay. Breath of the Wild is significant because it favors the player's experience far and above Link's experience. The true narrative is optional because it's less important than the narrative players unfold for themselves. This is the reason the game has so much recognition. We are, as critics and consumers, adopting the belief more and more now that the player's personal experience, their relationship with a game, should come before the game's agenda. This is also what sets Breath of the Wild apart from other entries, and it is indeed the main appeal of an open world. While I am certainly for this philosophy, the issue for me is that if you tell me the content has as much value as I decide to give it, I'm not going to give it anything, because there's no point in making up excuses for lackluster effort on the grounds of it being open to interpretation. Your game, your responsibility to make the content meaningful. Give me a real reason to care about the characters. Make the shrines have something aesthetically compelling inside them. This isn't a high bar I'm asking for. Seriously, just do something. Instead, you go to locations that look the same as places you've been before, fight enemies you've been fighting since it started, and every dungeon follows a predictable pattern and contains nothing special. And I'm rambling now, so let me just get back on track. Perhaps the biggest disappointment for me was the absence of Link's green hat and tunic. It's such a minor thing, but when you have a character like Link, who's completely devoid of all personality and charisma, the green hat becomes a source of identification. In a similar sense, Master Chief's helmet is a green cap that conceals the character's face, so that the player can self-insert. The Master Chief has charisma though, so even if he has to take the helmet off, he'd end up remaining a character. Perhaps not a great character, but a character nonetheless. Breath of the Wild does of course have a green hat, you just have to complete basically every objective in the game before you can get it, which effectively made it not worth getting at that point. You can't even begin a New Game Plus with the Tunic of the Wild. Wind Waker gave the player a new costume to wear on their second playthrough, which was a tiny thing that Breath of the Wild should have known better when they made the most important armor set only accessible after the game was effectively over. I seriously cannot fathom how poorly this was handled. Link's outfit is more iconic to the franchise than literally everything else. Don't believe me? Think about it. There is one thing that is predominant in every Zelda title to date, and this is including the handheld games, and even those god-awful CDI games. It's not Ganon, it's not the Triforce, it's not the Master Sword, it's not even Zelda herself. Hell, Legend is not even present in every title. It's not even Link, because you can sometimes pick his name and be literally referred to by the name you give him. But you know what is present in all 18 Zelda games? Well, I would say you always undergo your adventure in a green hat and tunic, but not in Breath of the Wild. Sincerely, where does Breath of the Wild get the self-righteous nerve to break the most fundamental tradition in all of Zelda? I know it's just a stupid tunic with no value outside of what we as players attribute to it, but the fact of the matter is, we do attribute value to it. I mean, look, follow this logic. The use of fire arrows and the vast number of bows are much less rare now. You find them, you buy them. In previous titles, these items were given special significance. They were dungeon treasures that would usually have puzzle-solving value as well as additional uses like combat or quality of life changes. It's da-na-na-na, you got something special. That's all gone since we have the Sheikah Slate, and I'm okay with this, but it does mean that the rest of the iconography needs to be intact where it can. How many games have you played that have fire arrows or bows? They're not special in those games, and they're not special here. And that would be fine, minus the fact that they used to be special in these games. What is special about Zelda are the heart health meter, the spin attack, and its green tunic. You get what I'm saying? Alright, but let's pick on the oldies for a spell, because they're not perfect. The slingshot, for instance, and in some sense the bow in Ocarina of Time don't feel like loot as much as they could. The reason is they feel like a necessary part of the player's character abilities, in the same way as the sword. Sometimes when you play through Ocarina of Time today, picking up the slingshot can feel like doing a chore. It's an item that the game feels would be overwhelming to give the player from the onset, so they reserve it for a dungeon, and then give it the same fanfare as future treasures, even though it's practically a default character tool. Other items like the hammer and the fire temple only really had use in the temple themselves, meaning the item feels more like an elaborate key rather than loot. That one especially so since it didn't do much even in the dungeon you acquire it in. Breath of the Wild cuts down on all that time and investment and just makes the bow a common utility from the very start. And again, undeniably a good thing. Where Ocarina and pretty much every Zelda title was too reluctant to decide what to do with this setup, Breath of the Wild just comes out and flat out tells it like it is. You use the bow often enough, so just get it over with and give the player the bow already. Don't delay the inevitable. And then they said combine all those key items into one or two, and then make them physics-based so that they can be used to solve puzzles, per the original intent, but also for combat and miscellaneous things like being able to launch yourself into hard-to-reach areas. This is all really, really good from a gameplay perspective, and honestly from a Zelda game also. People complain about how you have to reacquire all the same upgrades all over again in Metroid games, but Zelda does it too, and it's been doing it for far too long. While that progression can be nice, sort of a light RPG, it can also be a bit tiresome, constantly make us work to get to the good content, or work just so we can play our character in the way they were meant to be played. The originals may have made you wait, but having recently played many of them, I found Link's expanding arsenal a pretty decent way to mix up the gameplay, especially with such a wide variety of enemies. The style Breath of the Wild goes for isn't poor, but it accomplishes this feat by minimizing Zelda's iconography for no damn reason at all. As if all this fun gameplay would have been ruined if we were wearing a green hat, or if Link was left-handed. It's like, it doesn't fucking matter, so just do it correctly. It'd be like if you picked up a new Superman comic book and his costume colors were green and purple. Not just for a spin-off or a clone or even a new character, it's literally just green and purple for no reason. It's not a new costume, it's not an updated costume, it's just different so that you pick it up and go, why? Like, why am I talking about this? Why am I making a video about the stupidest thing on the planet? I know he was right-handed in Skyward Sword, but they had a good reason for that. Most people are right-handed. The motion controls, it was important. It was a good decision. Like, I don't care that Link's right-handed. I don't care that he doesn't have his green hat. I just want to know why you made that decision. And it better be a decent reason. And that reason could be as simple as I just felt like it. That would be fine. You just wanted to change it up. I do that all the time. But the excuses that come up with, it's just, it doesn't make sense. Like, oh, the attack button is on the right hand of the controller. It's like, what? That's never bothered us before. Now it's suddenly an issue? Like, you're the artist. This is your project. It's okay to just want to do things differently for arbitrary reasons, but don't pass it off as it's somehow needed or it's somehow just a universal good thing. Like, have a reason for yourself before you make that decision, because then it shows that you care. It shows that you sat down and you thought about it and you put in the work. As it is, it feels like you just showed up to work one day and you were like, I just felt like Link should be right-handed. I'd be like, it's just, why? He's such a flat, plain character. This is one trait that he has that kind of makes him him. And it's like you're just ripping that away without a point, without a purpose, without intent. It's cool to change up a character. It's cool to make them go through trials or to have different incarnations of them. I love Toon Link. We all love Toon Link. He's totally different. But there was a reason that he's that way. It fit the style of the themes and everything that they were going for in that game. And this is just, it's just random. It just seems so arbitrary. Getting your green hat and tunic became a tradition that characters in Hyrule would perform. In Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, Link always holds it above his head in triumph because that's what it is. Needless fanfare. But it's one of those things that set Zelda apart. We want to rebrand Link with his champion tunic, and that by relegating the traditional tunic to late game makes it more valuable. But I counter back by saying none of us are going to be wearing it anyway, since we have an abundance of cool costumes to wear now. Or we all bought amiibos. The green tunic is nothing more than a sentimental relic from the past. But that's why it needs to be there. What's perhaps even worse is the tease. The old man gives you the warm doublet, which was a decent stand-in for the classic outfit. Why couldn't you have given us a green hat after we completed all the shrines? We would have had a nice substitute to use. Amiibos if we want classic versions, and a new, more traditional outfit by completing all the shrines. That would have worked fine, but no. In Ocarina of Time, you get the red tunic, and that means you can withstand heat, because heat is red. It's very overt, but I always saw it as being in alignment with the original. The red ring, the shield spell, and the red mail all turn Link's tunic red and give him a defense buff. In Ocarina, we now have heat to deal with, so the red tunic protects the user from that. But it's still a red tunic. The Zelda aesthetic has a red tunic, which can be acquired from a ring, a magic spell, or cloth itself, and in most cases it provides the player with a defensive boost or heat protection. If you bring your cartridge over to a friend's house, they can see your world and be like, your character's red, you must be really far. The red tunic is thus an iconic threshold for the player, a sign that they're triumphing over the many stages in the game's life, and a sign that Link is growing, evolving. You've progressed X amount of distance into the game's overall plot. It's been prevalent in nearly every Zelda title. If the red tunic does not exist, there's always something else to take its place, like the mirror shield. When you get the red ring in Zelda 1, you know you're about to face Ganon. When you get the mirror shield in Majora's Mask, you know you're on the final dungeon. When you get the telescope in Wind Waker, you know you're just starting out. When you get the Master Sword in Twilight Princess, you know you're just before the halfway mark. While not every Zelda title has the Master Sword, the mirror shield, or the red tunic, they always have some enhancement of the player character that, more than their immediate use, also signify how far along you are. On your first playthrough, it's a stepping stone, and you can feel just that little bit of growth. They are an indicator that you've progressed X amount of distance into the overall plot, and this serves as a threshold, a turning point in the legend of the tales of Link that are eternally retold. In Breath of the Wild, the red tunic is green, and you get it right at the beginning of the game. You haven't reached a threshold, you're just getting started. Okay, fine, there's no sense in mixing the two tunics, but I'll take it. But as it turns out, there are a vast multitude of items you can use to resist the cold, including food, clothing, and even flame-based weapons. These make sense, but they don't hold the same iconography. But what makes this just suck is that the Warm Dew Blade cannot be upgraded for some unexplainable reason. In fact, you can't upgrade the Shadow Link set either. Why even bother giving the player these things if they can't upgrade them? The Shadow Link set is particularly offensive since it's acquired only after you've completed all 4 Divine Beasts, at which point you're very far into the game and in need of the extra defense. The red tunic in Zelda's early years was also acquired extremely late, but those tunics actually benefited the player, so they were worth getting not just for their aesthetic value. When I met up with Kilton and learned about his shop, bought the Shadow Link tunic and took off like a geese in the wild of the night, the game finally started to feel like Zelda. I fully acknowledge it's subjective. My only point is that I think the player shouldn't have to wait so long just for the game to start to feel in the way that it proclaims it does. Arbitrarily discouraging the player from using the Shadow Link set due to its inability to upgrade, and the Tunic of the Wild due to it being acquired literally after the entire game is over, is something I cannot wrap my head around, as I do not see how it is open, free, narratively significant, or consumer friendly. But sincerely, I am willing to forgive the game's massive departure from the formula, assuming it capitalizes on its own ideas in meaningful ways. But it doesn't. This has happened to me before when I had a huge misconception over what Twilight Princess would be, based upon a couple of screenshots and an interview in Nintendo Power, Game Informer, or something like that. To me, Twilight Princess seemed like the overworld would be richly detailed with many towns and villages, much like how Fable is set up. There'd be quests, mechanics like the lantern we're supposed to make for a moody exploration through dark, monster-infested woods. We'd encounter spirit versions of enemies in the Dark World, and this would make the Dark World more difficult, but yielding better loot. And not unlike Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, it would be an integral part of the overall experience. We both know this isn't what you get, but I retain that Twilight Princess is one of the better 3D Zeldas, in spite of falling short of its promised vision. Hell, not only does Twilight Princess not measure up to its own agendas, but it even has senseless thematic omissions like no dodongos and no musical instrument that allows warping. I mean, these are classic Zelda. But I forgive it because Link has his green hat, is left-handed, at least on GameCube, and there was a justifiable reason for the Wii. Remixes on classic Zelda enemies and even series staples make a return. Heart pieces, dungeon treasures, and 7+ full dungeons, which is more than I can say about many other console Zeldas. The double claw shot and arrow flows are perfect examples of how you can deepen Zelda with something fresh while respecting the old. And to top it off, it even came with hidden skills, which gave you a little bit of a leveling system. Something like that never reached full potential. But isn't that always the case with Zelda? The sea has too much downtime, hidden skills don't add dynamic gameplay like they should, and divided dungeons and brittle weapons don't deepen the experience. They just ruin the foundation. You see, Breath of the Wild didn't need to do every bit of iconography. Don't put Gibdoos in the game. Don't bother adding Pose or Guraya. But like the Lynels, they're there in Zelda's iconic database to save you from having to stretch yourself so far to come up with new enemy types. If you don't want to come up with new enemy types, and you're not willing to even bother with classics, then what the fuck are you planning on putting into this gargantuous map? My friends, size, like graphics, is not everything. Because it's not just its lack of enemy variety, it's lacking location variety. You go from one forest to one desert to one mountain and back and forth between all of these over and over again. It's just snow and rock, a couple of trees. You're never lost in Breath of the Wild, stumbling into haunted graveyards, majestic temples, bloodied prisons, shipwrecks and waterlogged marshes, or underwater biomes. And even in the rare instances there is a semblance of this, there's no unique enemy types, special characters, at least not any with distinctive charm, no unique weapons or skills to unlock, no surprises whatsoever. It's just all complacent. More Korok seeds, more shrines, more perplexed characters ogling the shrines, as if I'm supposed to vicariously covet them through these uninformed locals. Neither the characters nor the locations had imaginative concepts or creative expression. The game is just this insanely short loop over and over and over again. When a game feels so rarely like Zelda and then tries to do its own thing, offering no variety and routinely stumbling and tripping over itself. And listen, a good sequel does not protect Breath of the Wild from being critiqued as its own experience. Breath of the Wild can do 1 to 2 things well, like the music, the atmosphere, the lack of hand-holding in early game, and there's a fair amount of this good stuff, so it's easy enough to pick up and have fun. But the value, the staying power, being able to upgrade my weapons, fill in a chart has traditionally been derived from variety and nuance, and that's been completely neglected here. People talk on and on about how you make discoveries yourself, such great innovative game design. Yeah, it would be, but look at how it's handled. The Korok sheets, the shrines, they're not discovery. Kilton was a discovery. He was literally my favorite part of this whole thing. Not only did he have charm, was well hidden, and offered unique content that I couldn't get elsewhere, but he was about the only thing that represented a morally gray space. Kilton seemed to be the only character who was in touch with the dark and the taboo of society. And I've always loved the creepier moments in Zelda. Going into graves and getting my head bit off by zombies. That stuff was the shit. Just look at this. It's dark as hell. And as a kid, you always felt like the game was taking you seriously. There's a big difference between making your content for kids and making it kid-friendly. The latter is far better in nearly every instance, I'd argue, but especially so in video games. Old games, those from the millennial generation, are known for having particularly dark themes, ideas, and events in them. It was their limited graphical capabilities mixed with a lack of awareness on the part of parents that they managed to be a hugely appealing form of entertainment for children and young adults. In other words, a safe space for kids to try reconciling their understanding with adult themes. It's the equivalent of your big brother taking you out to a horror movie, or hearing a frightening story across a campfire, then lying in bed unable to sleep with your imagination running rampant. It scares the shit out of you, but you can't help but love it, because you were treated like an adult. Left to your own devices to make sense of, and in many cases, build up the courage to push past the fear. Where are the Redeads, Gibdoos, and Wallmasters? The dark element is all but absent in Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. Skyward Sword I can understand, since stylistically it's more cartoonish than even Wind Waker. The shonen anime vibe didn't help matters either, as it'd be a little out of sorts to have Redeads exploding the scene with acrobatics and super fist energy bolts. But Breath of the Wild is set in the apocalypse, and the only vaguely disturbing elements in this game are a handful of skeletons and a monster-hoarding fanatic. I like those things, but it's safe to say there could have been a lot more. It might be retreading old ground to have a graveyard with Pose, but the new setting and more dynamic combat has already done so much that I imagine it would have felt fresh regardless. Breath of the Wild doesn't have to be dark, but Zelda's archive is overflowing with horrific monstrosities that aren't on the same level as Dark Souls, but are a point of intrigue for many children and young adults. I even had to Google to make sure Pose weren't in the game somewhere, because I was shocked when I remembered not seeing a single ghost at any point in the game. And a ghost is about the easiest thing to make more juvenile, let alone design. It's 3 cutouts on a bedsheet, for fuck's sake. I'm seriously shocked. Countless soldiers and civilians alike have given their lives for Hyrule and suffered at the plight of Ganon. It's a war-torn continent, and there's not a single ghost? Guess I could count the Lord of the Mountain. Zelda used to have no problems dropping you into a pit of acid and blood with groaning zombies. Entire dungeons and quests were themed around terrifying ideas. Just look at these images. Its absence is yet another thing I have to add to the list, because outside of the same overworld adventuring, I don't know what this game has to offer for the long term. On a related note, the director for Breath of the Wild is the same director for Skyward Sword, if you can believe that. Either Hidemaru Fujibayashi let his hair down, or he exercised a huge amount of restraint to be able to direct 2 completely different games. I mean, the massive reversal in how one game holds your hand and the other doesn't alone is so dramatic, I'm a little shocked the same person was on board with both ideas. But as I had brought up before, Breath of the Wild, while not holding your hand, externally dumbs down everything around you. The thing is, Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild do have much more in common than you might think. I'm more and more convinced that this new director is in no way in touch with Zelda's iconography, forcing his stupid stamina watermelon down our throats at every conceivable opportunity. In contrast, Ichi Aonuma, creative director for Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, has proved 4 times over how you preserve Zelda's essence while trying new things. His style can be seen in all 4 titles. Ever notice how each of them have an emphasis on transformation and duality? If not Link himself, there are always characters who have unknown parts of themselves unveiled throughout the story. Even in something like Ocarina of Time, Link ages 7 years and has to combat adulthood before he's ready. The hunt for one's identity, trying on new masks, these themes are integral for a young adult mind. Transformation, duality. I might suggest that these themes are inherently dark, their origins residing in Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And regardless, all 4 of these Zelda titles are absolutely unapologetic in their concern for the dark. You got betrayers, loss of innocence, identity hunting, death and legacy, roles for something greater in life, the animal side, skeletons in the closet and self-benefiting motivations, grown men possessing young women, and hideous transformations. Wind Waker is certainly the least of these, but it's a jovial atmosphere and has its fair share of dark moments regardless. The point is, a good adventure is not just full of pleasantries like Breath of the Wild. No, a grand adventure has more than that. Horror, romance, self-discovery, redemption, swords, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles. Without having played Skyward Sword fully, I'm not feeling the dark, the transformation, or the duality in these new games. You got the reveal of the King of Hyrule, who's a ghost, so there's our ghost. Then Link dresses as a woman that one time. But honestly, purchasing a dark mask that drives fear into those around you said far more than the deceased king, who basically just said, "Look, here's the lowdown. Ganon's not really a person anymore. He's just some symbolic manifestation of a plague. He's got my daughter because she's somehow not aging. Go and stop him. Don't fuck it up like last time, you little shit." Ganon can be a beast without speech, but Ganon as a force of evil has to do more than sit exposed at the top of a tower. In Ocarina of Time, Ganon lived in a community of all women. I always saw his efforts to conquer Hyrule as stemming from a masculinity complex. Think about it, he's the only male in a culture of all women, and is given the title of ruler without earning it. He has to take Hyrule as a show of proof to his masculinity, and to fulfill on his ability to be a good thief to the tribe of thieves. What gesture could be more powerful than the heist of an entire country? That's why he taunts Link with his phantom, why he's playing an organ as he awaits Link. Link, of course, has no trouble getting along with women. He doesn't do anything to be liked by them. It's only worth killing Link once he, like himself, are at full power. He wants an honest duel. He's a thief, but an honest thief. Link earns feminine affection without even trying, and this combined with his origins mark him as an equal with Ganon. In Wind Waker, Ganon's got this whole crisis of faith going on, and in Twilight Princess, Ganon's so goddamn evil he rivals Emperor Palpatine. Even Majora is some psychopath Joker shit. It's not like the 3D villains have huge amounts of depth, but they had something to get attached to. They at the very least did things. Ganon employs various tactics to attempt to outwit the player, has henchmen to dispatch, and secret magic abilities that make him seem like a real threat. Not knowing the full extent of Ganon's powers is one of his biggest assets. Seeing nearly every one of Ganon's abilities right when you first encounter him, and only having one other form in which he is effectively crippled, is not going to cut it. I guess the idea behind Breath of the Wild is that Zelda is containing Ganon inside Hyrule Castle. But even if that's true, talk about a weak story. You're emasculating your villain. You can't have beats or arcs if the character can't even move. This time around, the focus seemed to be on Zelda herself, which was also an interest in Skyward Sword, I might add. I do like that she is getting more attention. Zelda in Skyward actually reminds me of a friend of mine from my community college days. She's playful with lots of personality. She feels like a real teenager, which I thought was great. In Breath of the Wild, she's kind of hard to connect with. I like that she's smart and dealing with a failure to uphold responsibility complex, but she spends most of the game being depressed about it, then spontaneously defeats Ganon at the end. Where is her arc of transformation exactly? Again, if she was playable in New Game Plus, we could have used that time to fill in those narrative gaps. She seems to resent Link because he can do no wrong, and I don't know that having Link talk would have worked too well, but he kinda needed to. He's Zelda's co-star, and she's left to carry the weight of every emotional moment solo. He doesn't need to talk, but he doesn't laugh or smile or bring her flowers. He just never feels engaged unless there's something to kill. It would have been nice to have a memory or two of Link growing up as a farm boy, or in training as a knight. I'm sure he had to climb the ranks at some point. We could have gotten some insight as to what's important to him. Why does he care? That would have been a useful memory to unlock. In past games, Link either has a personal investment in the mission or gets swept up into something much larger than him. But in this game, why doesn't he just chuck the slate into the ocean and take on a new name? The slate is what identifies him, so why not seize the opportunity? World's not so bad, just rains a lot, that's all. It's like Seattle. You'll get used to it. Ocarina did this better, since the death of the Deku Tree would strike Link on a personal level, since the tree gifted him a fairy as a show that he wasn't forgotten, not before the end. I mean, in truth, Link's just a pawn, only given nice things when people need something from him, but he's a kid. He's not going to see himself as being taken advantage of. Another advantage of having Link be a child is that kids are far more accepting of things without questioning them. As adults, we weigh the value of doing things, working extra hard to ensure it's something we want to do, or at least when it comes to huge long-term goals. Link's forced into this in Twilight Princess, and there's the whole theme of slavery, being unable to act of your own free will in that game. Midna can't be who she wants, Link can't be human, and Zelda has her kingdom taken from her and her body possessed. Even Ganon is banished, a prisoner sent to rot away in the twilight. Maybe there's a better take on this story in Breath of the Wild that I'm just not seeing, but to me, very little of it made any sense. Interestingly enough, the writing for NPCs I found to be a whole league better. There are many, many occasions when the game is able to playfully poke fun at what it stages in your mind, or the nature of gaming tropes. It literally feels like an entirely different team of writers compose the dialogue as the people responsible for the main story. Why isn't this great humor and wit not present in the main narrative? Like many other elements of this game, it excels in places it can afford to slip up on, but not vice versa. To get back to what I was saying about the differences in direction, I have heard that many of the ideas in Breath of the Wild, particularly the shrines, were being conceived by Aonuma himself back in the 90s. But my point is, if Aonuma had been in charge of Breath of the Wild, I'd like to think he would have poked and prodded the team a bit more to ensure each shrine was going to be memorable in some way. The shrines themselves, again, are not a bad concept. It's the way they give away the mystery and artificially inflate the size of the game. They don't want to hold the player's hands through characters who won't shut up, so instead they made the entirety of the content so easy that they're now mechanically holding players' hands. What innovation. They still have characters who don't shut the fuck up too. Maybe it's not Fujibayashi at all. Maybe Aonuma is getting rusty. I don't want to point fingers. And to the creators, please understand that I don't mean it in ill will. I know you did the best you could in the circumstances. But whatever it is, I'm just getting this sense that Nintendo as a whole is far more concerned with pleasing an American audience instead of doing what they do best. They routinely push their consoles into the hands of non-gamers and then either force gimmicks into their high-profile titles or otherwise dumb them down, gutting out anything remotely true to its spirit. And you and I both know why this is: to make money, because it's not enough to let the products speak for themselves, not enough to ensure they've enjoyed a growing fan base, not enough to be artistically or critically significant. From what we've seen of Super Mario Odyssey, I remain skeptical of what Nintendo's going to do in the future. How is Metroid going to turn out? What about Pokemon? Will they be safe because they're being handled by other developers? Or did the higher-ups give them a blueprint to follow? Look, if you're not hardcore and you had a good time with Breath of the Wild, that makes sense. I'm just saying there are better games. More specifically, much better Zelda games. And you don't need to be hardcore to get through any of them. Well, except Zelda 2. Breath of the Wild's minute-to-minute gameplay is a dramatic improvement over every other title, but when you hold it up against the artistic integrity of its predecessors, it just can't compete. Nowadays, Ocarina of Time is getting no small amount of criticism for how poorly the game is aging, and yet I just went through it myself for this video, and around every corner I'm in someplace new with new creative enemies, characters, and discoveries. Little touches that I had forgotten about. things that make the experience a special one. The targeting is a little wonky and it'd be more believable if Link had fingers, but the bulk of the game is holding up better than most games I play today. You can pick it up now and have a great time, and that hasn't changed in its now 20-year lifespan. And I don't think it ever will. What are we going to say about Breath of the Wild in 10 years? I don't know, but I have no interest in revisiting it. It was worth the effort to make the overworld the main course of a Zelda game. Because the overworld, when it works, is in fact truly remarkable. I remember this one sequence where I was on this beach, and I was bombing these tunnels so the wind could funnel through, and in the process of doing that, I'm taking on some Octoroks, some of which were hiding in sand, pretending to be treasure chests. I'm grabbing snails to make a soup later. I'm even solving a couple Korok seeds. I'm talking to NPCs and solving riddles. I'm watching the weather shift. I'm getting the drop on a group of enemies. I'm taking on Lionel mini-bosses. Hell, Lionels are back. We haven't seen them in ages. And that's when the game truly shines. It's all uninterrupted. You're running around, climbing, fighting baddies, and getting loot, and all the systems are feeding into each other for immediate use or later investment. It's different for a Zelda game, but that's okay. The main thing is it fun? And yes, it can be. But it's also hugely uninvolved, as this remains one of the very small handful of instances that are like this. I liked it better than Skyward Sword, which I can't even play because I despise motion controls, so there's that. I do think this is all going in a positive direction for Zelda. Link will get his green hat back, dungeons will make a return in full force. Hell, what I think they should do is build a Zelda game off of this engine, which I hear is happening. Make the overworld a little bit smaller, then add seasons. This way certain dungeons will only be accessible depending upon the season. You can make it a time travel mechanic also. In certain seasons, Ganon's power is stronger. We can witness the effects more, and the dungeons don't need to be labeled, because we'll know those within each season group will be of a certain difficulty level. This labyrinth was the biggest tease out of the whole game. I legitimately thought I had found a dungeon that I could only access with enough stamina. I did get a challenging maze, which was good, and a cool outfit in the end, but it ultimately boiled down to just a shrine and some materials. The game is far too complacent with providing surface content. You don't go into the depths, you don't bond with characters, who are still alive at least, or contribute to their personal journeys, which constantly made me think I should just see the game more as Zelda 1 than anything else. Except Zelda 1 was a dungeon crawler, and this is anything but. Some people argue that the hyper-cryptic nature of earlier Zelda works against it because it doesn't do enough to make newcomers feel welcome. I retain that this is precisely what makes those secrets meaningful. When you discover a secret in Zelda, either by guessing and getting lucky, or by being told it from a friend, then in both cases the discovery is limited. You become part of a small fraction of people who know something. This is the reason why there are certain things most of us will only tell our partners, parents, or close friendships. This is also why certain books, movies, or games are more special the less popular they are. It has less to do with wanting others to not get the chance to experience it, and far more to do with the feeling you get when you are a part of a whole, and in that space are understood as an individual. In other words, community. The conversations I can remember having concerning bushes in Zelda 1 and Skulltula hiding places in Ocarina of Time are some of my fondest memories in gaming. That dynamic interaction is just not feasible in Breath of the Wild, where every secret is so easy and in my face that instead of rewarding how thorough I am, nor how social I am, the game is content with just taking up my time instead. With the way information is so accessible nowadays, there's no sense in making the secret so obvious. If it's too hard, the player can Google a map of all the shrines or the Korok seeds or whatever else. Breath of the Wild can partially dodge internet interference when it utilizes minigames or otherwise kinetic or skill-based tasks, which it does a pretty good job of, minus gyro puzzles. They just didn't bother hiding any of these secrets unless it was under a rock. Difficulty that was once built by level designers and artists is now the responsibility of the player. I think the reason people speak about how games should be hard so that the player feels accomplished is because they do not trust people to allow themselves the benefit of undergoing a transformative experience of their own accord, because it will also contain hardship, and most of us prefer not to change. At least this is the case for a self-esteem perspective. I somewhat agree, but the way I see it, it isn't so that novice newcomers are forced to appreciate the value of triumph, rather, they're just missing out. Challenge is important not because it makes you tough, but because it encourages creative thought. Or are you going to tell me that brittle weapons encourage me to use variety? I don't even want Zelda to be hard like it was on NES, though the option not locked away in DLC would have been nice. but I do expect to have a silly green hat and to carry the sword in my left hand at the very least, and I don't think those are unreasonable requests. I don't care what genre you are or how much fluff you can put into your game, you need to account for the series' aesthetic history. And beyond that, your own game needs to be more accommodating for people who want a deeper investment. Because it doesn't hurt people who want the shallow experience. Let them cruise on through. You could do both. If they were going so far away from the Zelda formula, why not ditch the Divine Beasts entirely and put that effort into something more valuable, like more challenging shrines, a new Game Plus mode, or perhaps the ability to play as Zelda? That was a big unintentional tease when the game was announced, but it's a feature the community has been highly accepting of for a long time. The storyline was so basic as it was, you'd only need to change about 2 cutscenes, revise a decent handful of NPC dialogue, the armor sets, and get some more voice work for grunts and shouts. I think this would have been a nice gesture to the openness the game so proudly claims to be about. And it wouldn't stomp on Zelda tradition since you could preserve it for New Game Plus. You're just dressing Zelda up in a green hat and tunic. And playing as Zelda is something that either can never happen, or absolutely must happen at some point. Her name is in the title. And yes, they don't have to have Zelda as a playable character, and I don't care all that much, but it would have incentivized me to play it again. We'd get some unique character interactions because of it, get a chance to deepen Zelda's character, as she'd have new dialogue with her father, and the quest in the desert would be a walk in the park, which would be hilarious, and you'd gain an appreciation for the dynamic nature of the world and its inhabitants because of your unique status and gender. It would be a refreshing way to mix up the experience and deepen this otherwise incredibly shallow game. And what about female Link? I mean, I recognize that Link has been a boy since his inception, but that's just it. The green tunic is more iconic than Link's gender. He is that bland of a character, and the tunic is that iconic. Making people buy the tunic for a minimum of $15, or otherwise having to finish the game before they get it, is just not reasonable at all. If I was a producer on Breath of the Wild, I would have offered a few suggestions as I've done here, but I would have ultimately told the team they're doing a good job and not to worry about how risky the idea is. Because it's important to give them room to breathe. It's important to do things differently. It's important to break the mold. But the hard truth for the consumer is there are better Zelda games. And there are many missing refinements from the open world Zelda if Nintendo wants this to be a mainstay. I want the next Zelda to be an open world, but I want it to remember its roots also. And the way I see it, they can either bring back more traditional Zelda constructs or else double down on these new ideas until they function in the way that they should. In either case, Zelda will be just fine, since Nintendo has an extremely remarkable understanding of the importance of creativity for both its consumers and creators alike. And Zelda is frequently the flagship series they use to try new things on. Breath of the Wild expands upon Hyrule Field with a true open world. If that's all it did, I'd be far more forgiving of it. But it did so at the expense of any dungeons at all, and even completely trivial things like his hat, which as I stated could have explained its excessive delay with a slight adjustment to the script, but instead expects you to not care about any of these things that have been the key investment for over 30 years. And it's the second element, its negligence to account for Zelda aesthetics, progression, and secret hunting, is where it goes horribly amiss. This game is remarkable for what it is, but not for anything that it does. It's the difference between a game that's inspiring versus a game that's just amusing. I don't play games to be creative. I play them to solve problems. Earlier in this video, I said that 3D Zeldas have only rarely been about combat. I want to expand upon that here, and let this be my closing thoughts before we part. Among 3D Zelda combat systems, Majora's Mask is probably the best, though it is my stance that 3D Zelda is best understood as anti-combat. Consider for example the somewhat controversial duel with Shadow Link in Ocarina of Time. It's a beloved moment, but the gameplay leaves much to be desired. Or does it? The aesthetic department is having a clearance on everything badass in this room. The arena, the whole theatric of facing off against oneself, their dark counterpart, the elusive magic at play. Every detail down from the emptiness of the room until the emergence of the foe, always present, ever watchful. It would be pitiful to compare aesthetics between this duel with any of the combat shrines in Breath of the Wild, so let's not go there. On the surface, Breath of the Wild offers improved combat over Ocarina. But the thing for me is, Ocarina never had an interest in dynamic combat, and this fight is the proof. Shadow Link is a textbook bully, mimicking your every move, then capitalizing on weaknesses that the player has no control over. It makes the fight stale, but conversely, it enhances the intrigue. What will you do with an opponent who will take cheap shots at you the whole time? Throughout the experience, you've been programmed to rely on your sword and Z targeting, but to defeat Shadow Link, the player must abandon these instructions. Their mentor could only take them so far. It's up to them to make their own decisions, to outwit the Threshold Guardian. You can succeed with magic, but you can also turn the tables around by simply ignoring Z targeting. Shadow Link is a terrible combat challenge, but he's an excellent puzzle. He was one of the toughest moments for my siblings and I, taking us days to figure out a strategy that would work. Evermore, the aesthetics are all here: a fight, a treasure, a victory, and a push forward into the plight Ganon has brought. You want to talk about open game design? I think this counts. Again, to compare with Breath of the Wild's drones would be pitiful. And here's where an impasse has occurred. I sanctify Ocarina's combat by refusing to interpret it as combat. And I think if you've played it yourself, you'll agree this is a fair assessment. If you want that richly dynamic sword and sorcery combat, play Dark Souls. But I've criticized Breath of the Wild for the way it conditions the player into predicting that each shrine will grant a spirit orb. Why did I not make the excuse that this system is not bad design, but merely a departure from mystery and surprise, and into reliable progression? Why is it not rewarding to find a shrine when the intent is to give players an assurance, a reliable, desirable reward for their effort, of equal measure every time? This is bad for Zelda, because that's not what Zelda was about. Why are there combat shrines at all? Why is the combat system even here? Combat is not something Zelda has cared about since Zelda 2. Suddenly, it's relevant again? And I can welcome the brainstorm. I like combat in my Zelda, and combat still exists in Zelda. It's just never been very good. My issue then is, why isn't it good even now? This is why I entitled this video a comparative critique. It is not bad what Breath of the Wild does per se, but it is different, unnecessarily so, from Ocarina and the like, and it does its own pursuits with shaky legs and bitten fingernails. Ocarina's combat isn't good, but the game makes it very clear that combat isn't the intent. It gets a free pass. Breath of the Wild is about combat, which arguably it shouldn't be, so then I default to, is the combat good? And the answer I must give to not just combat but nearly every aspect of Breath of the Wild is, it's average. No free passes from me just because you've got a big map. What am I actually doing when I play Breath of the Wild? And what am I encouraged to think about? I'm climbing walls. I'm fighting enemies in a combat system with many hiccups and oddities. I'm traveling obnoxious distances to perform trivial tasks. You see where this is going? Who is Shadow Link? Who created him? Is he simply an illusion? Is Link fighting his reflection? What does it mean that darkness lies within him, within us? Is this all Ganon's doing, designed to psychologically confuse Link, drive him mad, make him angry? Do you believe there is a dark side in all of us? When I get sidetracked talking about Ocarina, it's because Ocarina gives me the necessary ingredients to speculate, imagine, and invest. It turns this digital, low-res polygon catastrophe into real emotions. Breath of the Wild gives me robots, text to explain why it's relevant, and then rinse and repeat. The most important thing for me in a game is this mental space. What will you inspire me to think about? What sorts of choices will I be forced to make? I hate being told to make my own fun, because I can already do that. I write novels, I write games and film scripts, and I've been doing these things since I could speak. I don't need flashy images and logos from my childhood. I can entertain myself. Give me multiple characters to play as, or classes, or challenging tasks, or a second quest. Give me dynamic choices. Give me a thoughtfully built world. Give me consequences that ignite interest. Don't stall the game by making me climb up the same brick wall all over again, but slower. Respect my time and my intelligence. So no, I won't be giving Breath of the Wild a free pass just because it's got a big fluffy map, just because the combat is more dynamic, just because it's non-linear. Ocarina of Time might not be a perfect game, but at least it addresses its weaknesses. It knows the combat is poor, so it makes Shadow Link a puzzle instead. It knows Ganon's model will age poorly, so it adjusts the atmosphere to ensure he stays intimidating. It knows players are forced to read through tons of exposition, so it makes the story a good one. It doesn't subject you to it arbitrarily, it had a point to make. You can't divorce the story and characters from the game-ness of Ocarina. Ocarina is a masterpiece, even today, because it knows what kind of experience it wants to give the player. And it's a damn good one. The only system in this game that functions properly is hunting. The world is inviting, the music is subdued, the incentive to gain money and food reserves from the day's scavenging. That system works. Truthfully, I enjoyed this game more when it was sitting at my desk at work. I'd set it up so that I could look out over the fields and mountains of Hyrule, the tranquil music and picturesque scene. Sadly, this was the best it had to offer, me not playing it, preferring to enjoy it from a distance. But I don't think it's fair to blame myself that our relationship turned out this way. You didn't give me anything I could invest in. Not the combat, collectibles, story, characters, puzzles. There's nothing in this game that requires more than an ounce of mental energy to comprehend. That's what makes this game so significant, though. It represents for me a shift in cultural values. Clearly, the gaming community is caring less and less about the artistic nuances and gaming norms of my time. Open worlds are laser-focused on making their experiences solely about the player's stream of consciousness, not their reasoning skills, nor memory. It's a combination of inconsequential imagination and instant gratification. This is a complete 180 with what I was conditioned to value in the games of my youth. Zelda, Donkey Kong Country, Metroid, Pokemon. These games always pushed me to work harder, to think deeper. They were firm in what they wanted to communicate. Their systems were built for the interpretation they wanted me to discover. Through playing, I learned to respect them. Through beating them, I learned to bond with them. There's a sense of wholeness when you reach the end of a long sequence of challenges. You share catharsis with the creators because now you both understand and have triumphed over the weight and the seriousness of those challenges. And that's life for you, a long sequence of challenges. And the victory is in not giving up. And now, what I just said is simply archaic sentiments. What people want nowadays is raw escapism. And, yielding my bias, there's nothing wrong with that. It's meditative, restorative, it's good. And let's not forget that the game is also a technical achievement. It's a huge map on a relatively weak console, with weather effects and many moving parts on screen at once. I get it. But I'm not here to talk about frame rates. I'm here to talk about artistic integrity. I'm here to talk about what and how games make us feel. And this is, of course, just my perspective on things. I'm sure if you willed yourself into a video like this, you already have a thoughtful stance on Breath of the Wild, to which I'd be curious to hear about, so don't be shy. Consider this also my critique of open worlds. Curiously, I don't play games for simulations of reality. I play them to enter fantasies.